Welcome to episode 6 of An Understanding. This episode will be about John Quincy Adams. If you like it, listen. If you don't, you guys can eat biscuits. Hope you guys enjoy. June 17th, 1775. Abigail Adams takes her son, John Quincy Adams, 8 years old at this particular time, to see Bunker Hill. She goes up to the top of a faraway terrain known as Penn's Hill to look on the experience. She wasn't supposed to go. John Adams actually attempted numerous times to stop her from going, for the most part. But she had to see for herself. She had to see the people of Boston fighting in what would be one of the most crucial battles, one of the first true battles of the American Revolution. She had to see what was happening, what her husband was fighting against and fighting for. And John Quincy Adams, the young 8-year-old lad who basically was, he's kind of the man of the house. His dad was always away a lot, trying to do a whole bunch of different things to, support the Union, support his country, be a founding father and all. So it's unfortunate, but every now and then he would always help his mother out in any way that he possibly could. And one day he went with her. It's about 10 miles away. In Charleston, from where Quincy was, where the family resided in the before it was called Quincy, it's called Braintree. John Quincy was able to look at Bunker Hill at 8 years old. This would be one of the very many experiences that he would be able to get, and many of the historical moments that he would actually get to see with his eyes. Let me read some of what he basically said in reference to him, his distressed mother, everything that was happening. Quote, "On the 17th of June, lighted the fires of Charleston. I saw with my own eyes those fires and heard Britannia's thunders in the battle of Bunker Hill and witnessed the tears of my mother and mingled with them my own. At the fall of Warren, a dear friend of my father and a beloved physician to me. He had been our family's physician and surgeon and had saved my forefinger from amputation and a very bad fracture." At the age of 10, John Quincy Adams would keep a diary and actually would write about this event, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and seeing it with his own eyes numerous times in his life. And his diaries, which he would basically keep for the rest of his life until the day he died, from age 10 to around 80. John Quincy Adams in his entire life covers such a significant part of history that it's almost insurmountable how much history he covers. Because you have to understand too, it's not like he's just in the United States the entire time. He goes to Europe. He goes to see, many of the sights, sounds, and places and historical moments within Europe as well. He gets to see Napoleon invade Russia. I mean, how many people can say they can see that? They could say that, unless you're Russian or one of the poor French soldiers or Italian soldiers or whatever people were a part of Napoleon's large amassed force. John Quincy Adams got to see the Battle of Bunker Hill, and that really changed his life, because from that point on, he's a little bit scared. His mother's very worried, fearful of the British coming in, fearful of the British doing, atrocious things. The stories that have been occurring all around the neighborhoods, yada, yada, yada. Oh, the towns. The British are coming. And they had to see it for their own eyes. An authoritarian regime taking on their colonists, overstepping their boundaries. And everything that his father's fighting, I think John Quincy Adams understood. And that's why John Quincy Adams always had respect for his father. And why his mother always understood the necessity of the things that John Adams did and the future that John Quincy Adams was going to eventually have. John Quincy Adams is our 6th president, one of our many Secretary of States, and one of the more interesting, fascinating, and overall historically complicated and yet significant presidents of our entire country's history. I don't know how to explain his presidency overall, other than the equivalent of a lame duck session of Congress, for better or worse. Nothing really got done. And although he had a lot of grand ideas, I don't know if he was ever going to be an effective politician, unfortunately. A great orator and a great debater. Probably one of the best orators and debaters of, this entire country's history. I mean, he got it from his father. He's probably better than his father, I would argue. And on top of that, he's probably one of the most significant secretaries of state in this country's history. Genuinely speaking, I tend to think, like Henry Kissinger and Nixon when they got, the Man of the Year, or the top prize for Man of the Year in Time magazine. And I tend to think that, if James Monroe and John Quincy Adams were alive today, they'd be unanimous choices for Men of the Year for a lot of things that they've been able to accomplish in this country's history. I mean, John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, is so effective, it makes James Monroe's presidency so ubiquitously incredible that basically launches James Monroe into the first unopposed president since George Washington. And a lot of that can just be attributed to just John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is a very fascinating person because of the point in history that he occurs in, because he's not a founding father, in my personal view. And it's nothing against him personally. I feel like if you're a founding father, you have to be part of the Declaration of Independence or not the Declaration of Independence, but you have to be part of the Revolutionary War, at least in some capacity functionally, and then a part of the Constitutional Convention in some capacity as well. And some people will debate it. Some people will say he's a founding father, and I don't agree with that. I don't think he had any fundamental significance or contributions during either the actual Revolutionary War or, the Constitutional Convention that actually allowed us to be a country. So that's why I struggle to say that he's a founding father. Because if you're going to say that, then you can say, like, if you just do one of those two things, then you can say Andrew Jackson, was a founding father. And Andrew Jackson's not going to be confused with the founding father in any way, shape, or form, even though he participated in the Revolutionary conflict as well. John Quincy Adams is also president during one of the most, era-defining and country, just the actual direction of this, what this country is going to go, points in history. The presidencies. He's the presidency between Monroe, which is the end of the founding father era, and the Jackson presidency, which is the beginning of the Jacksonian era, which a lot of people historically will always attribute to the rise of democracy and the rise of men, working men, white man suffrage, you can even say, people taking back and taking the country into their own hands. John Quincy Adams' presidency is kind of just this last-ditch effort by the founding generation in a lot of ways to try and keep the fires going, try and keep, in some ways, the aristocratic lifestyles and whatnot, and trying to keep power with the rich before it actually would go back to the people when Jackson becomes president, before they become emboldened in a lot of ways. It's also sad, too, because John Quincy Adams, in a lot of ways, is a politician and historical figure that's kind of lost in history, I personally would say. Because he's not directly with the founding fathers. He's just not. And he's also not with, the pre-Civil War presidents and politicians of that time, too. He's kind of just a man lost in time, I would say, significantly. Because by the time this pre-Civil War presidents come around and all those politicians come, he's an old man. He's kind of just hanging on for dear life, just trying to move forward and stuff. And, he's a man trapped between two significant eras, and he doesn't fit in either one of them. And it's really unfortunate, because when you really look at John Quincy Adams' life, what he wanted to do, I mean, if I had to put him ideologically speaking, I actually would probably say he's pretty center-left. Which I think at that time probably would have been slightly beneficial for the country, at the very least in terms of trying to get, economically speaking, a much more government with the federal banks and whatnot, trying to get people working and trying to establish a line of actual financial systems that are actually going to be conducive for the nation. Because I look at some of the policies that he was trying to do, at least domestically, and they're very forward-thinking in many ways, shape, and form. And the only aspect I don't like about them is the fact that the federal government is the one that's supposed to be doing it, And even he should know better than having the federal government basically be the leading person that's going to effectively control all the money and have all the power. Although in fairness, he's basically just a federalist. Although in fairness, he's just a Democratic Republican in name only and a federalist at heart, like his father. So it's no surprise there. John Quincy Adams is a very fascinating figure. You know, I mean, you want to talk about a person who's been able to record so much time in history in just a series of diaries and documents. Look no further than John Quincy Adams. And it's unfortunate he doesn't get talked a lot about. You know, his father doesn't get talked a lot about, and yet, you know, John Quincy Adams even more so. And it's unfortunate, too, because his father's gotten his image rehabilitated, and, you know, we're still kind of waiting for his son to get his image rehabilitated, too. It's just unfortunate that he ends up becoming president in one of the most problematic elections in this country's history, and ends up losing that election in probably one of the most embarrassing ways, probably since the moment his father lost the election of 1800 or 1801. Father and son kind of have a very similar path in life, and I think that's even more fascinating. You know, when we go into this deep dive and we actually try to understand everything about them, if you want to see how John Adams is, you know, in the future, you should really look at his son. And I think that's really interesting. They're not obviously perfect comparisons, but in terms of temperament, everything, it just sounds just like John Adams. John Quincy Adams is, for the most part. But anyways, you know, before we actually get to what the legacy is, who this person really is, and really understand why he's a significant person and come to a relative objective and subjective conclusion, let's start with the deep dive. And let's start with his childhood. And I think this is going to be interesting because, you know, this is going to be a pretty simple and similar childhood since the actual parents are, you know, the the person I'm reading a deep dive on. So, anyways, hope you guys enjoy and hope you guys listen. Okay, anyways. John Quincy Adams is born on July 11th, 1767. He's the first son and second child of John Adams and Abigail Adams. He had an older sister. They're pretty obvious. You know, John Adams is the second president of the United States of America, first vice president, one of the big individuals in the creation of the Declaration of Independence, a big individual in the leading ideas of republicanism. How would you describe the relationship? It was solid. You know, it wasn't like the greatest father-son relationship by any stretch of the imagination. They wouldn't be, you know, the closest people. But it was more about admiration, respect, and a genuine kind of just like love, I guess you could say. But not like, you know, like either John Adams wasn't going to like, you know, teach his son to ride a bike or anything. It was always going to be more along the lines of, I'm going to discipline you and to make sure that you are going to be this particular individual that's going to be a, you know, a positive on society for the most part. And that's how John Quincy Adams was raised by his father. I'm going to call him, let's separate them. John Adams is John Adams, and John Quincy Adams is going to be Quincy or Jr., just for my sanity. Quincy was basically raised and very disciplined, and, you know, his father basically controlled his entire upbringing, at least in terms of education, you know, all the little tidbits and whatnot that go along with being basically the son of a founding father and a president. But it was close, you know, and like it's one of those relationships that, like, when John Quincy Adams gets older and he becomes a very successful individual, he kind of looks back and is like, you know what, I'm successful because of that, because of my father, and I absolutely respect all the things that he did for me and pushed me to really become a better individual. And, you know, his other siblings would suffer for it, unfortunately, because, you know, it's a very strict discipline, pushed for them to really succeed, and ultimately ended up ruining the lives of a lot of his siblings, unfortunately, notably his younger brothers. It's really sad and unfortunate. A lot of them would be, as they put it back then, accustomed to the drink, you know, liquor, drunkards, eventually. But, you know, it's one of those things that, like, you know, when you look back, you're like, damn, you know what, my dad did a lot for me, and I didn't realize it, and I'm a pretty solid human being in person because of that. It's one of those relationships. His relationship with his mother is a little different, It's much warmer, much more loving, obviously, because he was a bit of a mama's boy in the very beginning, especially. It's a little bit difficult when he becomes a teenager, unfortunately. When he grows up, the relationship becomes a little bit strained. How do I explain it? Well, I look at it this way. When he's growing up, his father's out there doing the founding father stuff, and someone needs to be a bit of the man of the household. So when he's like 8 or 9 years old, he really starts taking on that mantle. And around that period of time, he's going around doing errands with his mom, going out to Boston and going out to various different places, and he's just the man of the family. And his mother greatly respects him. She educates him. She's a big reason why he's highly educated. She herself was being a very educated individual, and not to mention too, she should hire tutors and whatnot. But the relationship becomes a little bit strained for a lot of reasons. One, they don't see each other for basically, for the most part, from his age like 10 to 16. His upbringing, and when she sees him and he comes back, she's like, "Oh, my boy, no," as most mothers would probably be. And she does a lot of things that Quincy doesn't really like, because especially since he goes to Europe a lot for his minister's job, marries a girl in Europe, and his family's kind of like, what the fuck is going on right now? Like, it's a complicated dichotomy with that relationship. It's still always loving, still always endearing and caring, but it's always going to be strained because of just him growing up for the most part, unfortunately. Anyways, so growing up for John Quincy Adams is very, very fascinating. First and foremost, they call him Johnny. They didn't want, because obviously they didn't want to get John Adams or John Quincy Adams really confused. It is what it is. They either called him Johnny, I call him Quincy. They probably call him Quincy, but I'm not going to say that. Only because I can't really confirm it, but, it is what it is. Normal childhood for the most part. He initially lived with his family in Boston, as the prelude to the actual Boston Massacre. Unfortunately, he'd be about 2 or 3 when when his father does the actual case, and basically is the God, I can't think today. When he's the actual judicial he's the judicial person who's representing counsel. God, why can't I say fucking counsel? When he's the counsel of the British soldiers during the Boston Massacre. Which, I think in the HBO show, he's like 10. And I think they're just trying to put that there just cause. Even though it's historically grossly inaccurate. I'm getting way off topic here. Anyways, once the family and the revolutionary fervor starts getting to the family, then they move to the farm in Braintree, which is now called Quincy, ironically. And I think that's named after his great-grandfather. His middle name being Quincy as well. Anyways, other than that, I would say Johnny. I think that was his nickname, Johnny, and probably Quincy, although it seems pretty simple and standard. Had a normal childhood for the most part. I mean, the only real difference would be the specific revolutionary fervor in the background of Massachusetts, and just the reality that his father is a founding father, which I think is going to be interesting because there's a couple of other presidents who have had fathers in the Revolutionary War era who have participated in Congress around this particular point in time. John Quincy Adams, sorry, I apologize. Remember to call him Quincy and Jr. He was normal for the most part, a normal upbringing, other than his father really beating into his head education and his mother, being strict about it and really building the level of religious discipline that a lot of the other kids would be growing up with, etc., etc. A normal childhood. He played. He read a lot. He got to see the farm. He visited the city with his parents all the time, father and mother on separate occasions, or both of them at the same time. He got to visit a lot of family, namely Abigail Adams's sisters and family members and siblings, to their respective farms and houses, and played with a whole bunch of kids when he was younger. He was a pretty solid older brother, and made sure, and felt like he felt like he had to be the man of the house when his dad wasn't there. So he would really take up that mantle and responsibility growing up. And I think it's really interesting. When you look at people's childhoods and how they effectively become the people that they become, I think it's a little easier and harder at the same time to really decipher John Quincy Adams' upbringing. Because, I make the point sometimes that if you want to know what John Adams is like much older, in like the pre-Civil War era, for instance, you really have to look no further than his own son. His son really adopts a lot of the really good and a lot of bad qualities, and he actually had more bad qualities, I feel like, than John Adams, because Quincy, John Adams Sr.'s dad is a really, he might be boorish, he might be stubborn, he might be arrogant at times, but you know what, he was a very personable man, and he was very loving and empathetic and caring. If he wasn't, then he would have never, regained his friendship with Thomas Jefferson or other people for the most part, during the last years of his life. Quincy he just wasn't a personable person, and he was someone that was really difficult to like at times, and, he was beyond stubborn to a point where it really affected and ruined a lot of his relationships. And if I'm going to be 100% honest with you, it effectively ruined his presidency too, in a lot of those instances and ways, which I'll get to when we talk about when he gets elected president. But for the most part, I think a lot of these things you can kind of start seeing in terms of the personality really boring out. He's a little more serious at this time. He doesn't really hang loose for the most part, and a lot of the diary entries kind of go with this, like because he still wants to have fun and be a kid, but he really separates the two of them for the most part, being a kid and being an adult. And I think most people are kind of like a mixture of the two, and very few people really separate the two for the most part. And what I mean is like, every single adult, I think, has a lot of kiddish and immature things for the most part about them, and John Quincy Adams, in like a really weird way, kind of is able to separate the two of them. At the very least, it's just based off of writings and what we know and what I see. Like when the whole Bunker Hill thing happens, he's very scared, and he's not like a kid scared, but like an adult scared. Like he's fearful for his mother. He sees his mother, freaking out all the time because they feel like the British are going to be coming, and every time a Revolutionary War regiment walks past their house, he salutes them and praises them for the good work that they're doing, but not like the way a kid does it. He's kind of grown up in a lot of ways, but at the same time too, he's also a kid, because like when he becomes a kid and does those really immature things, he ends up really going off the deep end a little bit of those things. At one point, which I'll explain in the future, that he fails his entrance exam because he's not prepared, and I'd probably say that's just because he didn't take it as seriously as he probably could have. And then when he does, he ends up becoming one of the best students at Harvard. I don't know, I'm going way too deep into this specific aspect of his childhood, but this is just how I see him for the most part, and this is how I see at least partly how his childhood really changes and molds him in a particular way. So Quincy's growing up, he goes through the motions of a young lad. When he's about 8-9 years old, he sees the Battle of Bunker Hill with his eyes. His mother just takes him. They just want to see it. And and he becomes fearful at that point, like I said before, because the war is here, and his family has a target on their back, unfortunately. John Adams basically writing and having his name on the Declaration of Independence, and doing all the things that he would end up doing really sparks tensions, and the Adams family becomes a little bit fearful. Sometimes they'll leave and go stay with family, or just really hoping that there's a lot more American Revolutionary regiments basically that protect them. But for the most part, the British have their own other priorities other than the Adams family, thankfully for the Adams family. So he ends up just really having a bit of an anxiety attack at this point, with just the potential for things to happen, at the very least. It's a little bit like Madison in some senses, where there's potential for things to happen, whether it's be Indian attacks or the British coming and taking everything away. And especially in Massachusetts and the media there, you tend to hear a whole bunch of different stories, a lot of it true and a lot of it false. The assaults that happen, the rapes, etc., and like it can get to you a little bit, and it is what it is, unfortunately. Around this particular time too, when he's getting older, his family, mainly his mother, I believe his mother, gives him a diary from basically his father. His parents give him a diary, and he's like, what the fuck is this? And then he's like, well, you can write down your feelings and stuff. And he's like, well, okay, I guess I can write down my feelings. And he starts this diary for two reasons, to be honest. One is because I think he's a very objective person sometimes, almost to a fault. And although in reality too, he's not objective at times to himself. Although he does make an effort to try to be, you know. But he basically wants to check himself and understand why he does things. So he'll write in his diary and be like, well, this happened today, and I don't know why I felt this way, but at the particular moment, I did it that way, etc., etc. And also, too, because I think he realized that history was unfolding, you know, and I think he understood the gravity of having, you know, some historical documents for the future, both for his legacy and his father's legacy and the history of the world from his perspective and point of view. You know, people were very aware of this, and I don't think a lot of people are as aware of this now as they were back then. You know, like, we're all capable of being big and famous, and we don't really keep the same level of, you know, documentation that we normally would for, you know, generations down the line, although we're much more conscientious and capable of it in relative comparison now than we were back then, obviously. So, you know, young Adams, young Quincy, he starts growing up, the war is still passing by his house, etc., etc. When he's about 10 years old, he's extra worried now. The wars continue to escalate. People are dying left and right. You know, I mean, he still has the memories of Bunker Hill, and he would always have those memories for the rest of his life. You know, and then one day his father comes home, and his father's like, yo, fam, I'm going to take a break from all this, so I'm going to send my lazy boy. So then he sits on his lazy boy, and then immediately gets a knock on the door, you know, and he's like, what? And then it's a messenger. He tells me he's got to go to France, and he's like, well, fuck you guys, but fine, I'll go. And then he immediately goes to talk to Abigail, and he's like, hey, Abigail, we're going to take Quincy with me. And she's like, what? Why? You know, French philosophy educators, maybe learn from the guys like Descartes or Voltaire, you know, a whole bunch of those particular individuals, Montague, etc., etc. And, you know, she's like, I don't feel comfortable with it, but, you know, you had me at Voltaire, I'll put it that way. Tisk tisk, you know, but anyways, you know, he's really apprehensive about it, and Abigail's very apprehensive about it, but she understands that it's quite literally one of the many opportunities that it could be one of the few opportunities that Quincy might actually have to not only go travel to Europe, but potentially travel the world and see what happens and where it's going to go and where it's going to lead to. And Quincy he's really apprehensive because he doesn't want to leave his family, he doesn't want to leave his farm. He doesn't want to leave his siblings, too, you know? And his siblings aren't going to go because they're too young. I mean, Charles, I think at this point, is like 5. So, you know, they're going to stay there. And, you know, after some apprehension, Quincy's like, all right, I'll go. I'll get ready. So he gets ready. They end up leaving soon after on probably one of the most arduous boat rides of his life. You know, he goes on the boat, you know, and because you have to understand, too, it's like heightened British tension. So, like, Great Britain's just, who are you? You know, every single ship. Actually gets to a point where John Adams goes out on the deck of one of the ships with like basically a musket or a pistol out there, and he's like, who am I gonna fuck up next, you know? And Quincy's like, Dad, don't embarrass me right now, you know? And cause it's the Adams family. Well, around this time too, I'm pretty sure he learns French fluently at this point, because I know his father attempts to learn it, and it's a little bit difficult, and he learns enough to really get by. But you know, even John Adams is kind of like, damn, son, You're pretty intelligent, you're pretty smart. I probably forgot this too. He's intellectually gifted. I'm talking about like a really, really. I don't know if he was. I would say, you know, like a photographic memory, but you know, he had this capacity to really understand and learn. And I think it's really. I should probably have pointed that out earlier. That, you know, because one thing, you know, obviously when people say they're gifted, et cetera, you know, it's kind of like, you know, it's like nepotism in a lot of ways, where it's like, of course it's my son, I'm going to say he's gifted, but like genuinely, truthfully, I mean, there's stories of like, yeah, because I always like to bring up the story about Quincy Adams, because he would always read the Bible at least once a year, front to back, the entire thing. I think it might be the Old Testament. But he actually read it front to back in like numerous languages, French, German, even Latin if you could find one, Greek, and I'm just like, the fuck, man, like little things like that. He would learn at least like 6-7 different languages, Russian, you know, little things like that. And he just had this aptitude and capacity. And it could just be for languages, but he was an incredibly bright, intellectual, and very forward-thinking individual. When I say he's like John Adams, I think he also has John Adams' mind and mental capacity and imagination. Like I said, the difference between mainly Adams and Jefferson is, Adams is much more of a person who can create and conceptualize an idea for the most part, like a perfect republic. And then Jefferson's the one that can really, he won't come up with the idea, but he can really tweak it. And he can really manipulate it into something that might seem like it's original, but it's really not. If that makes any sense. And I think John Quincy Adams is similar in that particular vein and light. He's a hyper-intellectual person. I should also probably point out, too, politically and ideologically speaking, he's always going to have the heart of a Federalist, but a very liberal-minded Federalist. I should probably do this for all the other subsequent presidents from now on, because the ideologies become much more clear and certain based off of what our current subjective understanding is of ideologies. Like today, John Quincy Adams would probably be a constitutionalist, center-left individual, is how I would probably interpret it. Him, at the very least, both on economics, et cetera, in terms of the level of influence the government has. You know how it goes. And he's a Federalist, so it is what it is. Anyways, they go to the boat ride, and they finally arrive in France. And while his father is doing the whole being a founding father, and I'm going to negotiate France getting into this war, just simple, fun, like founding father stuff, you know how it goes. Quincy enjoys France, put it lightly. He was really feeling himself, Imagine being an 11-year-old kid in one of the most, brilliantly beautiful, vibrant, liberal cities in the world at this point. And, he gets that education, for the better part of however long he's there. And his first initial stint, he's studying. He learns French fluently, several other languages, a lot of the Greek philosophers, Latin, especially poetry. Like I said before, he loves poetry. And he would love French poetry. And basically just enjoy his time there for the most part. So, once his father does his whole negotiating thing, he's like, bah humbug, and then returns. He goes back with his father. Much simpler boat ride than the one before. And once he arrives back home, he's a little bit sad, but he's effectively just trying to get used to the whole America thing again, especially when you're in France for however long he's there, 7-8 months for the most part. And he gets to enjoy being with his family, being with his brothers, obviously, etc. And at this particular point in time, however long he's there, I kind of forgot. It might have actually been a lot longer than that, a year or two, because he's about 12, 13 when he comes back, and at this point he's trying to prepare for Harvard. Because when he comes back, because I remember college age at this point is roughly about 14 years old, so he's just studying, he's just doing his thing, trying to get prepared for college for the most part. He's getting himself into the mindset, and he does really well, because when he does focus, and he goes all in onto this adult thing, and by the time he becomes an adult, and he goes into the political sphere, he goes full adult. There's no kid anymore in John Quincy Adams, unfortunately. But for the most part, when he focuses. He's on his A game at this particular point, and he's learning all this stuff. And then, while his father is kind of negotiating a bunch of shit for the most part with France, trying to do his thing, trying to get support, his father's like, damn, the United States need the money for this war. Should probably go get some loans. So, after much negotiation with his wife, he convinces her to also take their second son, Charles, along with him. He's a little bit older. He's much more capable at this point. And Charles would stay with John Adams for most of the time at his father's side. John Quincy would go all over the place. But anyways, Quincy goes back too, and he's a little bit upset because he's kind of just like, man, I just got used to America again. I got used to all this shit, so now I got to leave again. And it's tough. You go basically on an adventure for the most part, then you come back to normal life, and then you want to get back into customs to everyday life and just really prepare yourself for your future, and then bam, I gotta go to France again. So, that's just how it was for the Adams family. Europe, round 2. Well, anyways, second go of Europe. John Adams, they all arrived in France. Both Johns, John Jr., Charles. They all arrive, and basically the John Adams Sr., he goes all around Europe, mainly with the Dutch Republic and the Netherlands area, to try and accumulate money and loans for the war effort for the most part, and try and recognize America as a sovereign nation. It's during this time, Quincy basically just goes to school. He goes to school, learns from a whole bunch of different teachers all around Europe for the most part, and not to mention too, he ends up going back to the Dutch Republic, reuniting with his dad, and going to Leiden College there, where they kind of make fun of him because he doesn't speak fluent Dutch, little tidbits and stuff like that. It's things and little facts like that I kind of just find funny and interesting to give more credence to the time and era for the most part. During this particular time, Quincy's kind of enjoying himself, if that makes any sense, because, he's getting older. He's 13, 14 years old. He's a teenager, and basically you're kind of an adult at that point. So you're feeling yourself, you're enjoying yourself, maybe stay out late with some hot Dutch bitches, you know what I'm saying, and do some things. And it's kind of cool for young little Quincy to really enjoy himself and feel him and really understand who he is and kind of grow up in that weird particular spotlight. And this is also the point where I think the best case for Quincy to become a founding father is his participation within the Revolutionary War itself. You see, John Adams, he also brought along his assistant. Well, he came later, I think. His assistant's name doesn't really matter to the story of John Quincy Adams, but his assistant is he's going to be this envoy to Russia, but he can't speak Russian. So the only person that can speak Russian that they have in their contingent is John Quincy Adams. I think soon after, too, Charles ends up going back home because he can't handle his father's extreme parenting, by the way. Just want to point that out there. It'd be the problem with the other Adams kids, unfortunately, and Quincy Adams' kids as well. The strict, disciplined parenting on top of the excessive pursuance of education. But basically, Quincy's like, hey, do you need me to go to Russia? I'll go to Russia. And John's like, you sure? It's pretty dangerous. I'm like, oh, okay, sure. But whatever. It is what it is. He wants to go to Russia. He wants to enjoy it. I don't think he realizes how cold a Russian winter is. That being said, yeah. Anyways, they go to Russia. The whole point of them going to Russia is so that Russia can either help them with loans or just see them as a sovereign nation. Having Russia be your backer is like pretty fucking, it's pretty legit. I mean, like a good sports reference is probably like, if the British are like the New England Patriots, then I guess you could say Russia's kind of like, it's a good team example. Kind of like the Giants, I guess, where, sometimes they'll just win a couple, they'll just surprise the living hell out of you. But for the most part, they're just a really well-respected dynasty franchise that's really down on their luck for the last couple years, et cetera, et cetera. Along those lines, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That being said, they go there. They go to St. Petersburg. It's full of crime. The economy is really down at this particular point for Russia. And John Quincy Adams is just like, damn. Man, Russia. Who knew? Oh, some big titty Russian bitches. I'm going to have fun. And then, he stays over there for a little bit. God, how long does this stay over? He stays over there for about 2 years. He comes back to his father about 16, and during this particular time, he is enjoying himself despite the cold. And they spend quite a while trying to just negotiate and get Russia to just join into the actual war effort itself. I understand it's like 1782 here. It's a little bit later in his timeline for the most part. And he takes his time coming back. He probably meets some big boobied Russian broad. I know that would probably slow most people down, so it's kind of understandable in that general regard. Anyways, he ends up meeting back with his father in the Dutch Republic, and it's pretty interesting. His father's just like, "What the fuck you been?" And Quincy Adams is kind of just like, "Yeah, vibing, just vibing, Dad." Quincy, like I said, Quincy Adams has had a very fascinating European upbringing, and I think that kind of helps him and really kind of just exposes his mind to differences of ideas, differences of cultures, and it's like seeing a lot of this stuff and makes you think. Like I guess let me put it to you this way. After I'm stumbling over my own words, is I think a big reason why it's difficult for him, especially in politics, is that I think he's had too much European intervention to a point where I think he doesn't know how Americans interact sometimes. And I think it warped his perception on how to communicate with people in the United States. at least to some degree, for the most part, because I think like Thomas Jefferson was kind of this way too. I think Monroe, and Adams, I think, you know what I mean. It's just like you kind of like develop that culture, you take on that mindset, those mannerisms, and for him, basically adopting about 15 different fucking cultures, it seems like, it kind of changes you in a lot of ways. Anyways, he comes back to his father. And his father's like, where the fuck have you been, et cetera, et cetera. He's like, well, you need to hurry up because we need to go to France right now. And it's like, what the fuck's going on in France? Well, the war's about to end, so we would like to, hurry the fuck up because they need me to negotiate. And he's like, oh, shit. So I'm going to go get some more french fries. Well, anyways, Quincy joins him, his father in France, to do the whole negotiating with the Treaty of Paris. And he's just enjoying himself once more, enjoying, the whole... in the life of a Frenchman, basically. And after they do the whole negotiating with the Treaty of Paris, they end up going to Britain soon after, because his father's going to be the ambassador of Britain, or the first minister of Britain, whatever you want to call it. And he ends up going to Britain and enjoying a very brief for the most part, British education. And getting all the Lockean philosophy really beaten into him. And he ends up, he doesn't really meet the king or anything. He just enjoys his life for the most part because, King George is a little bit salty, but Adams is trying to repair the relationship in general. So one day, while going to school, and he comes home, and his dad and him talk, and he's like, look, this has been a great adventure and whatnot, son, but you need to go home to your mother, you need to see her, and above all else, you need to go back home to the United States and be an American and get an American education. And he's just like, what the fuck, Dad? Like, what's the point of me coming here if I'm just going to be an American? And it's just like, well, you're an American. You're very different. You got to deal with that shit. Anyways, they basically decide, after a lot of negotiation and talking, that Quincy's going to go home. And he's going to go home, and he's going to fulfill and get the United States an American education. So he gets on the boat to go home, and, he's thinking about his life, reflecting on stuff, and thinking about what his future's going to be like. And, like most young kids and young adults at this point, he's about 16 when he comes home. And, you have to ponder what life's going to be like, and how you're going to go down this path that you plan to go on. And, I don't think anyone really understands, even back then with limited options and whatnot. For him, he could really do whatever he wanted. So, and I think that's what is very interesting with ultimately the career path he chooses, and it ends up just being like his father. He goes home, he sees his mother. His mother's like, what the fuck? You're a man now. And he's like, yeah. Not douchey or anything, but, like, he's a grown man, and it must be tough because it's no longer her baby, She's a very affectionate and loving person, an empathetic person, and John Quincy Adams just wanted to be an adult around that period of time. As soon as he comes back, he immediately goes to Harvard and is like, hey, let me take the entrance exam. And he takes the entrance exam, or whatever the equivalent of an entrance exam is, because he's trying to go in as an upperclassman, so he doesn't have to take like another 3 years in order to, get up to the point where he's at for the most part. He fails, which is kind of embarrassing. And the point I was trying to make earlier about, how he's acting like a kid and acting like an adult, like, this is where he was kind of acting like a kid, and he wasn't preparing himself properly, because soon after this, he goes full-bore adult, full-bore adult, because this is really fucking embarrassing. And his father's like, oof, disappointment, son. You're supposed to be the golden child, And ultimately, he ends up getting tutoring. His mother helps him, and his mother really just beats into him. 2 + 2 is 4. And then, gets a bunch of other tutors to help really prep him up and everything. Philosophy, mathematics, English, writing, arithmetic, more work on the languages and etc. You know how it goes. Anyways, he retakes the entrance exam, but like 5-6 months later, after going full bore into this education, and ultimately ends up succeeding finally. He goes in as an upperclassman eventually, and within, for the most part, I want to say about 2 years, he ends up graduating second in his class. And again, the education standards and how to rank people back then were very different. It was more on a social status than anything else, but by all accounts, his education was top notch, and he was on point with all his assignments, everything that he did at Harvard, his father's alma mater, which is very interesting that he was second in his class on a social scale and level. But but everyone thought he was going to be this prominent person, this very important person, because all that he was capable of doing, which I think is really interesting. So, after he graduates, it's about 1786, 1787, around the time of the Constitutional Convention. Country's in a bit of a crisis, economically, socially. Taxes being raised, and it's also ironically too that the direction that this country's going to go in is also the direction that John Quincy Adams will go in. So I think it's really interesting because he's trying to figure out what direction he's going to go in order to improve his life and do something that's going to be sustainable for the most part, just like this country. So, what does he do? Well, he ponders for quite a bit, actually. It's really ironic with John Quincy Adams, because by most accounts, I would say the two things he did not want to do was be a lawyer or be a politician, for a lot of reasons. One, I think it's because he grew up with it and knew how on one hand it's volatile and on the other hand it can kind of be addicting. His father would really deal with that for the most of his life and politics, and I've never been in the whole political scene, but when you really think about it, when you join and you represent a bunch of people and you legislate certain things and certain laws that will affect people's lives directly, I can only imagine there's got to be a bit of an adrenaline rush in some ways, shape, and form. And it's not because of the power. It's just, I have this ability to affect change, I think, is fascinating to a lot of people. So I don't blame him for that. And I think he saw that. And I also think he just didn't want to be a part of the eventual fighting that was going to happen, because, he got all the education from all Greek philosophy, so he's seen it all before. Number two is, although he loved and respected his father, I think he wanted to go a different path and not go under his father's name and his father's legacy, which was this very prominent lawyer and founding father, congressional and political leader, But at the same time, it's difficult too, because, around that period in time, before the whole Industrial Revolution really comes around, he wasn't going to get into a specific trade, or I didn't think he was going to be business savvy either. So after some deliberation, just trying to figure out what he's going to do for a couple months, really just trying to understand, what am I going to do? Am I going to be like my dad? And ultimately, at the very end of the day, he's just like, my dad's not so bad, and ends up basically, along with the help of his father, gets an opportunity to clerk under a prominent jurist at this point in time, Theophilus Parsons. Really, really, really prominent person in Massachusetts. His father gave him the hookup, and he struggled initially. He didn't have a natural affinity for it, and he didn't really enjoy it, if I'm gonna be honest with you. So for the next however many years, I think for the next 2 years or 2-3 years that he ends up studying under Theophilus Parsons, it's a bit of a trial for him. A lot of things are going around this particular time too in this country's history. The Constitutional Convention is literally happening in the next couple months while he's studying all this, and actually gets to read it. And this is where I think it's interesting, because he's basically just like his father, where it's I don't agree with all of it, but I understand the necessity for it when he gets a chance to read a version and copy of it. So anyways, around this time, he's a young adult. He's in his early 20s. Around this particular time, 20 to 22 years old, that he's studying law, and he starts getting the habit of it. He starts getting the hang of it, because he's not, at this point, he's not the great debater or orator that his father is. Ironically, I would argue that he actually becomes much better than his father once he gets, the status and the ability and capability and practice with it, and it really helps too that he actually creates he creates what is this conversationalist club. I don't know what it is, but I'm just guessing. It's I guess you could say it's just what place for young adults like him would basically it's like a pool hall of sorts where people go just, hey man, let's talk about sports, let's debate, let's talk about music, let's dance. It's not scandalous, but it's youthful fun for the most part. It's scandalous depending on the religion that you're a part of at that particular time. But he would grow and enjoy the freedom and socialize with many people, including females of that particular time and era. Which is interesting. It's literally just like going out and going clubbing, but with debates. So after some more time, it takes him about 3 years for the most part. But eventually he decides he's ready, he's capable, and takes the Massachusetts bar and passes with flying colors. It's around this time, too, that a lot of things are happening to John Quincy Adams. His father becomes vice president, and he attempts to open up his own practice in Boston, notably. It's around this time, too, while in Boston, he'll try and open up this new practice of his. And, he says he's a young social man, a socialite. He meets a brilliant, beautiful woman named Mary Fraser. They're both instantly attracted to each other, and he wants to marry her, and he wants to be with her. But the big problem is that he's broke, and he at this point is his own independent man, and his parents and his family are kind of like, look, we love her, but at the very same time, if you can't support her, we're not going to support you just to support her. Okay, you gotta grow up, you gotta do your own thing, etc., etc. And they date for some time, and it's very apparent that he can't support her. A marriage, a family, a kids, things that she's gonna not be able to facilitate. It's gonna be all on him. And he doesn't know right now in his life whether he's gonna be able to really financially be secured. Because, at this point, he's not this great lawyer yet that he eventually will be. He's pondering what he's gonna do. And ultimately, he tells her, Mary, I cannot do this. I don't know why he's Spanish at this point, but I cannot do this, okay? Anyways, he breaks up with her, and she's really brokenhearted too. And I think she marries someone else, but she dies really young. Is what my recollection is. This is something that's really fascinating too, because I think this is one what if for John Quincy Adams, because he deeply loved her and would have married her. But he chose not to. In fact, he would actually have a lifelong affinity for her until her death, and be mourning her well after in his older age, even the loss of one of his loves. This is one of a very fascinating love story, and a very unfortunate one. So when he starts his law practice, he's average at best. A lot of people were kind of thinking the Quincy Adams, the Adams family, that's a really prominent name. Two big problems. One, he really didn't care for it all that much. He really didn't like law, which is ironic. He was really bored for the most part of it, the studying of law, despite having the mental acumen and intelligence and emotional intelligence. I would actually say at this point of being a very, very competent lawyer. And not to mention too the conversationalist clubs, I guess you could say, the debating, the orating. It started becoming natural to him at this particular point. I think he was hanging around his dad too much lately. He ends up becoming a pretty solid orator around this particular point in time. He starts becoming good, and yet at the very same time, what do you do when you're bored? You go home, you read, and what is he reading? He's reading philosophy books, poetry, political theory, political books. His father would sometimes give him some books and be like, hey, you should probably read these books, A lot of them on constitutional republics, and not constitutional republics, republics in general. And, he started getting creative, I guess you could say. He's really starting to become like his father, because he ends up going as far as to write essays under the pen name Publicola, which is a little tidbit. It's another name of the Publius person from the Greek history, just like the Federalist Papers named after him, just a different type of it. Another Roman statesman for the most part, and a couple of these papers actually around this particular time are in defense of George Washington, who pleaded neutrality during the conflicts in Europe when they began occurring in 1792, 93, 94 range. So he's really just trying to become a lawyer, and really slowly dipping his foot into that political lake and that political river, man. I'm telling you. Anyways, after for the better part of, I would probably say, 4 years or so, once he opens up his law practice in Boston and breaks up with his future wife, or not his future wife, doesn't become his wife, but future, long lost love, I guess you could say. He's an average lawyer, And there's a lot of reasons for it. He didn't care, but not to mention, too, his practice struggled because, he competed with a lot of other senior lawyers, and it, basically your name isn't going to be the only thing that's going to help you, And if anything, it probably hurt him because, John Adams is a very complicated person. And, being basically a Federalist in Massachusetts, Boston, it's popular, but not as popular. It's probably a little bit more popular now in New York, for instance, with Hamilton and all them. Depends on how you look at it. I don't know the specifics of the political sphere around that particular point in time, but I don't think his name helped him, is what I'm trying to say. Plus, he didn't care. It actually was tough for some time, he didn't borrow any money or anything like that. At least I don't recollect or think. But he struggled financially, especially, which is the biggest reason why he couldn't end up marrying the Mary lady. So he's kind of just chilling for the most part. He's kind of in a bit of a funk right now because he's just, I'm not good at this lawyer stuff apparently. I mean, I have all the capability, capacity, and I can do all this stuff, but it's just not for me for the most part. He finds out really quick. He hates doing it. He really hates doing it. At this point he has the capacity and capability to really do it. By 1794, and he'll go visit family obviously and do his thing and enjoy his social life in his youth, while also trying to. It's difficult because he wants to get married and have kids and start his family, but he really can't because he doesn't have any money. So it's a little bit difficult, which is going to be interesting when he does get married. I'll explain that in just a second. Anyways, around this particular time, George Washington is still president by 1794, and Europe's in a bit of a funk right now, and he doesn't know what's going on in Europe, and Washington's just pondering, who do I know that I can, just send over and give me some heads up on what's going on. And he's like, John Adams is probably like, well, I got my son. He can speak 5 different languages. He's like, 5? Fuck. Why don't you fucking tell me? He speaks French, right? He's like, yeah, he does. Anyways, George Washington sends for John Quincy Adams, and he's like, yo, Quincy, you want to go to Europe and, be my minister and ambassador, etc., etc.? And he's like, well, where am I going to go? How do you feel about the Dutch and the Netherlands? And he's just like, all right, fine. I guess I'll just do whatever I got to do. Well, anyways, so first off, he actually goes to France first. He goes to Europe and France, which at this point is in full-blown, revolution, okay? I think Monroe is there as the ambassador and minister, but I don't know if he really trusts Monroe at this particular point in time. They would have a difficult relationship. So Quincy goes to France, adds in full-blown revolution in this war, and he gives reports to Washington of what's actually happening. People beheading each other, hearts being ripped out, changing the calendar, little things like that, because, Catholics did everything, so they created time, whatever. And then goes from there and just straight up goes to the Netherlands. This is a very interesting point. Because you see, at this particular point, America still got debts. We got to pay off Britain, and we're not making our payments lately, or at least enough to. We're not making the minimums, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And he goes to the Dutch Republic in particular, and it's funny because his father's the one that initially started it, and he actually got a couple loans to help out, but now he's asking the Dutch for some more money and maybe some more secure loans and negotiating a whole bunch of different stuff with the Dutch and trying to also establish some relations for trade, little things. And it's kind of funny because at this point he's actually a really good debater, orator, communicator at this point, and this is effectively the beginning of his foreign policy. You have to understand, it's really interesting, is what I'm trying to say, how his political career really effectively begins. Well, anyways, he did so successfully, and again, after this, he really just enjoys Europe, he travels a lot, goes to all the places, Italy, I don't know if he goes to Italy actually, but I know he goes to France again. He's going to go back to Russia eventually. He just enjoys his time there, being the minister to the Dutch Republic and whatnot. And he occasionally goes and visits Britain sometimes. One of these trips in particular is to meet with Joshua Johnson. he's actually a family friend. Stayed with him initially the first time, the Adamses, when they went to Britain. And the entire family's based in London. He was actually there to exchange the ratifications, I guess, of the Jay Treaty. I find that very interesting. Anyways, you have to understand too, because like when you go and visit someone, you tend to stay for quite a while. You don't just like one day and dip. It's usually for multiple days, especially with travel back then. And John Quincy Adams decides he's gonna go visit him. He's gonna spend basically the spring, I believe, of 1795, or the winter, spring or winter, the winter for sure. To take it back, of 1795 in Britain, in London, I believe, with Joshua Johnson and his family. Now he has 3 daughters. It's very interesting. And John Quincy Adams kind of likes all of them. You know what I'm saying? They're all of marriage age at this point. Not like weird, like 14-year-old. And cause I think at this point, John Quincy Adams is probably about, 28-ish? 28, 29-ish, And he's, I understand too, at this point, he's 20, 29. He feels like a man today in his mid-30s, and he hasn't gotten hitched yet or married yet. And, I feel like he doesn't want to be too old to have kids. It's still a bit of a mindset even back then. Anyways, they're having dinner one day, and the middle child in particular, Louisa Johnson, she starts singing in the middle of dinner, and Quincy Adams fucking hates it. He's kind of developing the personality that he would always have, where he's just like, yeah, I'm no fun. Ugh, hate women singing. Which is funny because apparently it kind of turns her on. I don't know. Some of the stuff in writing and emotions back then are really fucking strange. But anyways, I think she's just attracted to kind of like his stoned off personality. Like, who the fuck is this guy? I'm interested. How you doing, stoic person? And really kind of annoying. And I guess it's just like a combative, playful nature that develops between the two of them. And Quincy ends up really liking her and taking a liking to her. In fact, that he's just like, Mr. Joshua, may I ask, may I marry your daughter? And then, it's just like, whoa, what the, really? Interesting. Why do you want to marry my daughter? Well, she's ravishing, and I would like to not be a virgin anymore. And he's like, well, sure, why not? Okay, anyways, the relationship was really strange, okay? And he will be his wife, so I'm just going to explain the relationship. When they do get married, it's a very fascinating relationship. It's not loving, if I'm going to be brutally honest with you. It's a partnership, but I don't know if I can really say that's loving, because first and foremost, the parenting style of John Quincy Adams is not very conducive for their kids, and on top of that, everyone has their breaking points, and for Louisa, for her in particular, especially after he continued his political career later in his life, she refused to support him. That being said, it's also very clear to the both of them, there's still love there, there's still a connection there, there's still meaning there, and they would generally still be in each other's lives for sure up until his death. So it's one of the weaker overall presidential relationships, in fairness, but it's not the worst, is what I'm trying to say. Also, a little bit tidbit too. She's technically the first female foreign president or first lady in this country's history. The second, I think, actually being Melania. So take that for what it is. Technically, she is, because even though her father's from America, I think he's from Maryland. She was born in England, so she's technically British. So it is what it is. Anyways, soon he pops the question, and she's like, oh my goodness, it's very loving and very passionate in the very beginning, and he's messaging his parents, and his parents are kind of just like, why are you marrying just, look, we love the Johnsons and Joshua, but do not marry her, marry an American, we are Americans, okay? And, in fairness, too, it's like, well, oh my God, John Quincy Adams, the son of, at this point, eventually, the president is married to a British broad. Like, that's just political hell that he's going to have to go through for the most part. It doesn't really occur, though. No one brings that up, thankfully. But soon, they eventually do get married. in 1797 in June, after a couple years. It's fascinating because they basically court each other. He would go back and forth between his ambassadorship and then go see her and stuff. And they're actually trying to negotiate some stuff with Joshua and the family because there's supposed to be a dowry for both of them. If you know what a dowry is, it's basically like, money or some form of property. It's like, if you marry my daughter, you get this, etc., etc. We gift you this kind of thing. And neither side really had anything because the Adamses are focused on trying to, be president and stuff, and the Johnsons and Joshua didn't have any money whatsoever. So Adams is kind of like, oh well, shit. It sounds bad. It's actually kind of funny. Apparently, like, Joshua Johnson soon fled the country afterwards, leaving his family, and his daughter's probably like, "What the fuck, Dad? It's a bit of an embarrassment for them for the most part." So, anyways, they go back to the Netherlands, and his father becomes president when they get married. So, his father is basically like, "All right, you're gonna go to specific places." It's a little bit nepotistic. I'm not gonna lie, or at least a lot of people thought it was for sure. I think it was a little bit both nepotistic and strategic. I mean, how many people can speak like 6 or 7 different languages? Anyways, he initially gets assigned to be the ambassador to Portugal, very shortly after his father wins the election, but then immediately afterwards, finds relations with Prussia at, I don't want to say an impasse, but it's very likely he wants John Adams Sr., Big Daddy John A., wants his son and wants someone he can trust, in particular, to go to Prussia. So once they go to Portugal, he's immediately sent to Prussia. His wife is not happy, and in fairness, Quincy is a little bit frustrated too. It's a little bit difficult because throughout the rest of their time in Europe at this particular point, they'd be trying to have kids, and unfortunately, Louisa would have at least like 3 different miscarriages the entire time that she's there, and it's really difficult for them, to keep losing kids, and it puts more stress on their relationship and frustration on their relationship than necessary. On top of the fact that she didn't want to leave Portugal, and she's like, I don't want to go to Prussia, and John Quincy Adams is like, look, we just gotta do what we gotta do, and she's like, fine, fuck you. Difficulties with marriage. Anyways, he goes to Prussia, and it has a very long, complicated history. Prussia does, and what I mean by that is, I attempted to start looking up the history of Prussia and Germany and German unification, and it is fucking insane and fascinating at the very same time, which makes what Otto von Bismarck, what he does, is incredible by all accounts. That being said, if you don't know what Prussia is, it's basically like, I guess, and I'm probably gonna be wrong about this, but like the fundamental foundation of what Germany is. They're the German-speaking countries, for the most part, and they're a bit of a rising force in this particular time, because once they hit the 1800s, they're gonna start going back and forth with all their bullshit, whatnot. The Industrial Revolution is gonna hit them really hard. Karl Marx is gonna come out there and flame out because they're like, fuck you, Karl Marx. And then Otto von Bismarck comes in and makes him a unified superpower. That's just the brief history of it. Anyways, he goes there, and his entire purpose there is to see specifically the developing relationship between Prussia and a couple other different countries, notably Sweden and USA. And he's trying to get the USA within some trade deals with Prussia and Sweden for the most part, or at the very least try to figure something out there. Which is funny because they end up eventually agreeing to a trade deal with Prussia, but not Sweden. Sweden's kind of like, man, you aren't paying your loans, you aren't doing your thing, so I don't know what good you are. You can do all the cotton you want, but if Britain's it's complicated. It's all political reasons specifically. Anyway, like I said, his time in Prussia was tense, and Louisa was having a shit ton of miscarriages, and Adams specifically, he really just wanted to go home at this particular point. I think he wanted to go home, finally introduce the wife, and they would eventually have a son. He would name George Washington Adams, I believe, is his first son's name, which did piss off his family a little bit, because it's like, look, we love George Washington, although we will have a complicated relationship with him. Why didn't you name him John or Charlie, or name him after one of the ancestors, etc.? It was very that was a very bit of a tricky impasse for his family, and they felt a little bit butthurt by that. Anyways, around this particular time too, for at least lucky for Quincy, after about 4 years, in Portugal and then Prussia, working out trade deals and actually improving relations for the most part with the German states. Unfortunately, his father loses re-election to Big Daddy Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson's like, look, I love you, Quincy. You're my homeboy, and I always love and respect you, and I loved you growing up and stuff. Because, the Adamses and Jeffersons were really close. But Tommy J is just like, man, gotta get you out of there. I need one of my home people there. And John Quincy Adams was like, say no more. So in 1801, John Quincy Adams comes home, finally, after a very, very long time. 1801, he comes home. And he's fucking happy. He starts kissing the ground. He's like, America, No, I'm not to be rude or anything. I just think he just missed being home, especially after 7 years. And, you get sick of things for a while. You want to show your family off to you. You want to show the in-laws off to your wife. Or, no, you want to show your wife her in-laws and get harassed because you named your kid George Washington Adams instead of John Quincy II Junior Adams. I don't know what the fuck they were gonna call him. He comes home and he has to start a new life again, in a sense, and he ends up trying to restart his law practice. And keep in mind, it's been 7 years since he's done law, so he's really rusty. And it struggles, unfortunately. There's a lot more prominent lawyers in that particular era because, and they're not all there, by the way, but, a lot, like the next generation of lawyers are coming up all across the country, the likes of like Clay, etc., etc., etc. It's not just him. Anyways, he attempts to create his law practice, I believe in Boston again, and it sucks. So he's basically just trying to figure out ways to make money, and all he really knows is law and a really solid general education. So he's thinking, what can I do? And he ponders it for a second, and at this point, in fairness, he kind of has a bit of a hunger for politics. In particular, I just think he's thinking to himself, what can I do? And if you go into politics, you get paid, and you actually make a pretty decent living doing that, which is why a lot of people end up trying to run for, political office, because you actually get paid, and you also, get to change the law and get to change the government and run the government for the most part. He ponders it for a second. His wife is a little bit apprehensive to the reality of it, but she's just like, look, just make your money, okay? I'm gonna go through have another 10 miscarriages. Sorry, I'm being an asshole right now. Anyways, he decides, okay, cool. So basically the full following year, in April of 1802, John Quincy Adams effectively applies and campaigns and wins a seat on the Massachusetts state legislature, the Massachusetts Senate. He wins the state legislature seat, and this is gonna be brief because he really doesn't do much here. He just basically does, little things, more of a name recognition. He initially tries to run twice, again for a federal national seat, an actual U.S. House of Representatives seats initially, and he doesn't win that one, but then he will eventually win a seat within the Senate. He becomes a senator. And, what is it? Yeah, 1803, he tries to be a senator or a House legislator, and then later that year ends up becoming the senator for the state of Massachusetts. There we go. I'm trying to get my timeline straight. If anyone I should get my timeline straight with, it should be John Quincy Adams. So, now he's officially in national politics. What is John Quincy Adams politically speaking? First off, I would say he's kind of apolitical. Because he's one of the very few, first off, look, he is a Federalist. And he's always been a Federalist at heart. And at this particular point, he's one of the very few Federalists, or I guess you could say relatively well-known Federalists, that's going to have a relative impact on national politics, both in name recognition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Hamilton's long gone, his father's gone. The party is kind of just running with Pinckney at this point. It's a rough transition for the Federalists at this conjecture. But for the most part, I would say he's pretty apolitical, which I have to give him some credit for because, he doesn't go by party lines all the time. He actually saw the idea of political parties as incredibly toxic. And even though he was a Federalist, he actually sided with and went back and forth and really didn't vote party lines throughout his entire legislative career. In fact, he actually was in favor of the Louisiana Purchase. Literally the only Federalist, I believe, to, be in favor of the Louisiana Purchase, because he's just thinking practically, like, y'all are fucking crazy. Like, this is a shit ton of land. Why are y'all antagonistic to this? This is real fucking toxic. You're like a bad ex-girlfriend. Boo. Anyways, during this, time with the Senate, like I said, his boorish behavior, he's basically just like his father, but if his father was in the Senate and not in the actual executive branch for the most part, it's a little bit difficult, He especially does not get along with his Federalist counterparts in particular, and they are excessively political and very, I don't want to say conniving, because I think the Federalists are at this point just kind of cutthroat, because they're just trying to gain as much ground as they possibly can, and anyone that's not going to be a Federalist, they're just cutting out, which ends up becoming unfortunate to the party's detriment too. And for the next couple years, because he ends up becoming a senator for quite a while, he ends up effectively kind of switching parties in a sense. Well, I don't want to say switching parties, but he was very conflicted with his political relationship with the Federalist Party, and it actually got to a point where I forgot what year it was specifically. It might have been like 1805 to 1807. They actually tried to have another candidate run for his seat, especially. And he basically just resigned and said, "Fuck you guys. I'm just going to be a Democratic Republican and run under this." Hang on. I'm getting ahead of myself. So, what I mean is he specifically resigns from the Senate because they're basically offering up a seat and they're going to contest the seat with another Federalist. And it's likely that Federalist is going to win because they're just doing a campaign against John Quincy Adams. He would just develop a lot of enemies at this particular point in time. Sorry for the dog in the background if you hear barking. Anyways, he just resigns. He doesn't play these games. He would eventually, although not particularly personally. He wouldn't. He's effectively just saying, "I'm done." He goes back to practicing law for a little bit, and he struggles again with that, honestly, but he's mainly doing it just so that he can open up himself for potential ambassadorship opportunity, because his relationship with Jefferson is improving, his relationship with Madison is improving too. He's low-key kind of growing up in the Poland-type political sphere for the most part, and he's made a name for himself being this outlaw of senatorial, I guess you could say, legislation, because he's not playing by party lines. He just does what's best for the country. And again, it just so happens to reflect positively for the Democratic Republicans, who are doing everything they can to support democracy and people's rights and the working man at times, until they don't. Politics, and Jefferson and Madison are not perfect presidents. Anyways, during this particular time, he's chilling. He does his law thing. I believe on occasion studies and teaches oratory at Harvard. I think that's really interesting while he's trying to figure out his post-political career. And this is where a lot of the little tidbits of his life really start coming into focus. Notably, like, him reading a Bible back and forth yearly in different languages, because he's just extra like that. And it takes some time, he takes some time because around 1807 or 1808, he ends up leaving and really attempts to really focus on law while waiting for another potential political opportunity. A lot of people would end up doing stuff like this, and Adams really is no different, and especially because, it's tough, because I think he wants to visit Europe, his family wants to visit Europe, and he wants to kind of in some ways give his kids a bit of the same education in some regards like that, I guess. And it's not until Madison becomes president in around 1809 that he really gets that opportunity. So Madison comes in and he's like, "Hey, yo, so what you doing for the next couple years?" And Quincy Adams is like, I teach on occasion. Other than that, just vibing right now. What do you think, man? You vibing to go to Russia? And Quincy Adams is like, oh God, Jesus Christ. Fine, I'll go to Russia. It's actually a pretty good opportunity for him, but at the same time, it's Russia, so it is what it is. He ends up being asked to be the minister to Russia, which understand the current political sphere that's happening around the world in this particular time, because the tensions are rising with with Great Britain, Napoleon's kidnapping popes left and right, endorsing himself king and whatnot, and Russia is starting to kind of just say, you know what? Because I think it's Tsar Alexander the First. The great grandfather of the last Tsar, Tsar Nicholas. He's basically saying, he's low key just giving Napoleon the middle finger. So he's just like, what? Like, tensions are rising. So for the most part, it's a big deal, because transgressions could maybe even lead Napoleon to make some, maybe it's probably unlikely, because just some insane march with about 500 to 6,000, French, whatever, Spanish, all these troops that he's accumulated into Russia, because no one's insane like that. Oh, he is. That's how insane he is. Anyways, just a little tidbit. John Quincy Adams will get a front row seat to see Napoleon attempt to invade Russia. I forgot how far Napoleon actually goes. I do believe he goes all the way to St. Petersburg, but not to Moscow, which is really good, and then ends up having to fall back as their forces end up being just taken over, and they falter in every sense of the word. And whenever I get to talking about Napoleon and Napoleon's specific attempted invasion of Russia in another episode, I can't wait to do that, because the more I've only briefly looked at it, but just from what I can see, it's going to be a very fascinating episode. Anyways, John Quincy Adams, again, is another one of these figures that gets to see a lot of things that we don't really get to see. We don't really comprehend at this particular point in time. But he gets to see this front row seat, and this is technically right before the War of 1812, when I believe when Napoleon attempts to invade Russia. For the most part, his time in Russia is fascinating. His wife fucking hates it, obviously, because it's cold, and she's trying to take care of a bunch of kids, and this is where their marriage really starts becoming not loving at all. It's becoming very frustrating. Okay. But for the most part, she did her wifely duties and did what she was supposed to do, because they were prominent members in Russian society. So he had to host some parties, get to meet all the prominent figures, and he would actually have a pretty solid relationship with Tsar Alexander the First and have a lot of positive things to say about him. And they would have a lot of visitors. You actually get to see the troop mobilization of the Russian military to combat Napoleon's army. I always think that's kind of funny. There's a whole bunch of written dispatches of amazement just watching it. The differences between the colonists when he was a young kid watching Bunker Hill happen during the Revolutionary War and now. It's very fascinating. And again, too, you have to understand Russia. At this point in time, it's war, poor, nobody had rights, and really, for him, he really just enjoyed the liberal freedom that he had, at least in comparison to the other citizens. Adams personally enjoyed his stay in Russia, and there's a whole bunch of stories, like in the mornings he would sometimes just do a chilly 6-mile walk before returning and reading his Bible on occasion, or reading another book, or having a brunch with Tsar Alexander, or maybe just teaching his kids the education and attempting to give them an education and trying to calm his wife's nerves. Like he was just really, really making the best of an interesting situation. I take that back. It was just he and his wife. It was a big reason why his wife had trouble. The kids were staying with the grandparents, John Adams and Abigail Adams, and they're old at this particular point in time. John Adams is probably in his mid-70s, and he's just puttering around the garden doing his John Adams thing at this point. And they're missing the family and missing the kids, so it was really difficult for them, and probably not really good for their eventual upbringing, being raised by the grandparents, because it's not like all the kids are being raised by the same strict disciplinarian that John Quincy and John Adams before him, eventually were. And it's a little bit difficult, and this would be a bit of a problem in their later years for the most part. So, once the War of 1812 begins, about a year or two after Napoleon's invasion, John Quincy Adams, he's worried. He's worried about what's happening in, America and stuff. His family in particular, protection of his family, John Adams, Jefferson, everyone for the most part. And it's around this particular point in time that Tsar Alexander I, he sees a lot of this happening, gets correspondence, some information on what's going on, and he's just like, hey, yo, you guys need help? He's like, well, I mean, we could, but, I don't want to get you guys in any more trouble than you already are at this point. He's like, well, we're not going to help, but we can mediate some shit, It's like, because y'all just are not vibing with each other. Y'all got to talk to one another, and Tsar Alexander basically offers to be the mediator, the mediating country between America and Great Britain. And, he really pushes for it. And I'll give, Alexander is a little bit apprehensive at first, but coming to the realization that this is going to just devolve into chaos for everybody because, England, for the most part, is still one of the big economic centers of the world, and everyone still needs English goods, and American goods. So it's a little bit difficult when one, rising power in America and one dominant power, they're just going toe-to-toe and putting all their resources to that. Anyways, Alexander I, he basically is trying to push and negotiate a peace treaty. He does this for the better part of 2 years. He and John Quincy Adams, and they start negotiations, and they actually start negotiations pretty early. And this is where Alexander and John Quincy Adams really become bros, like bros for life in a lot of ways. Not like, okay, you know what I mean, but they develop a really strong relationship and bond and personal affection for each other. And John Quincy Adams in particular has a really strong affection for Tsar Alexander. Thinks of him as admirable, something yada yada yada. He's a good man in his book. It's unfortunate his reign only lasts like 25, 24 years, unfortunately. The war was very, very strong and very dangerous, the War of 1812 and whatnot. But once Napoleon lost and then abdicated and then lost again at Waterloo and then all that stuff started happening, Adams, and with the influence of Tsar Alexander, Britain is basically like, okay, maybe we might start talking. I mean, at the same time, too, the War of 1812, they had suffered, some setbacks, despite some American setbacks. It's kind of funny, because they're kind of like, well, we just burned down the capital. Well, okay, we're taking out all the Indian tribes, and, we're starting to win in the Northwest, so we're going to take the Northwest, and they're kind of like, okay, maybe we can talk, and, once the talks really began, I think it's about mid-1814, in Ghent, Belgium, and it's this neutral site, other politicians, negotiators. Notably, Henry Clay joins in on the negotiations to help the United States. And excuse me. And first off, the negotiations for the Treaty of Ghent. Not only did America and Britain just basically fight each other for the most part, and again, this is one of the very few interesting wars because every battle we win, we have better, we can bring more to the table in terms of negotiations. Every battle we lose, and that's that kind of tide of war. But it's also made worse because Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay will be very important in John Quincy Adams' life much, much later. For the most part, they're just clashing, borderline fist fighting with one another because for a lot of reasons. I'll put it to you this way. First and foremost, Clay was a politician, I don't personally like Clay in a lot of ways. I think he's very manipulative, and I think he's kind of overrated in terms of a lot of his ideas, etc., etc. He's basically like all the worst qualities of Alexander Hamilton. But I'm planning to make an episode on Henry Clay as well, because despite my personal feelings about him, he's still one of the most influential politicians in that particular era, and he was a politician that can actually do this and play this political game. But, first on policy, because, Adams was not a politician. He was just a negotiator, debater, straightforward. And, it's very different in this type of situation to try and end a war than maybe negotiating treaties or not treaties, like trade deals and whatnot. This is basically like, hey, we're gonna play this game, and if you're not gonna play, then you're not gonna play. And Adams did not want to play at all, and Clay was willing to play. Not to mention too, like when they're doing all these trees and stuff, Clay would bring some people and make friends pretty easily. He was a pretty personable guy, and like, you know, he'd stay up for like fucking days on end playing poker and gambling. And John Quincy Adams, being religious and disciplined in his manners, was like, he hated all that. He did not like that, and he did not like those aspects about Henry Clay whatsoever. So they clashed, and they were just basically undermine each other the entire time, in terms of which specific deals, which specific, you know, direction this treaty was going to go. Because Adams was basically like, bare minimum antebellum, basically let things go back to normal for the most part. And Henry Clay's kind of just like, well, I mean, we could probably give a little or get some more, you know. He goes back and forth. It depends on how you look at it. And ultimately, after negotiations, they just decide, you know what, fine, just go antebellum, because that just seems like the simplest and easiest solution in, you know, the Second War of Independence. And they go with Adams' idea and his plan, equal footing, pre-war territories, everything goes back to the way it was. And they all agreed on December 24th, 1814. And I just want to make it a very fair point that a lot of people, again, say that the Battle of New Orleans is not important. It is, because they signed the treaty, but it was not ratified until after the Battle of New Orleans. So you have to understand that they didn't have to ratify the treaty. They could have just been like, oh, well, now we have New Orleans. We have this river that's really important to you guys, so fuck you, you know. Just want to make that very clear. And, you know, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay are the big individuals who really shaped this treaty. The treaty itself is just fascinating because, first and foremost, we again fought the world superpower, somehow less prepared than I think we were before, and we somehow came out on top again. You know, well, it depends on how you look at it, worse than before, but we had plenty of time in the Revolutionary War to really figure some shit out, you know, because the British were ready, really for the most part here. Like, they had a pretty large contingent force in the Northwest Territory that really fucked a lot of shit up, that made William Henry Harrison a very prominent individual in the Northwest. So after this, he ends up staying in Russia just for a little bit longer. But Madison's basically like, you did a fantastic job, and we need you to, but we're not done yet. We need you to finish the job for the most part. And Madison's just like, what the fuck you mean? What are you talking about? And he's like, well, there's still a lot of stuff that's happening with Britain, and we're going to send Henry Clay over to Britain, and we want you to join him in finishing some trade deals and whatnot. And he's like, ugh, motherfucker, I got it. Why do I have to do this? Huh? Why do I got to do this? And he's like, well, there's a bunch of Americans and we need to help get back over here, you know, so we just got to do it. And John Quincy Adams advocates because it's for the betterment of the country. So immediately after, he says his goodbye to Tsar Alexander I, be the last time they see each other. So, you know, it's pretty heartfelt. And then he goes to Great Britain with Henry Clay and a couple other negotiators. There's a couple other people. I'm only noting Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, because those are the two main points in the story of John Quincy Adams. And they go to Britain. They're trying to negotiate basically the little finite details of this war for the most part. Trade. They're trying to get all the imprisoned soldiers impressment soldiers that Britain basically took, get them back over there. Just resolving every single issue that they can resolve, even some territory and whatnot. And many reasons abound. Monroe being really forward-thinking around this particular time, while John Quincy Adams is finishing up the details and whatnot. Because Madison would leave, and Monroe eventually gets nominated and wins the presidency. John Quincy Adams is asked to be the Secretary of State for for James Monroe while there. And, you know, Henry Clay hears of this, and he's just like, what the fuck? And he's butthurt by all accounts by this. He is mad, Henry Clay, when he hears all this. He's like, I'm doing a lot of this treaty stuff too. Like, why don't I get any fucking cabinet positions? And I think Monroe attempts to give him something small, like, you know, like Secretary of Commerce or something like that. And Henry Clay is just like, fuck you, Monroe. You know. Anyways, after finishing up the little finite details in Britain, and his wife's with him the entire time, and she just wants to go home. So I kind of feel bad for her. This entire time in Europe, following and trying to be supportive of her husband has been very fascinating and very difficult, and really a bit of a trial on her and her family, since they haven't seen their kids in quite a while. I don't know if they would go back and forth in terms of visiting each other, the family and the kids, etc., but they're missing their kids growing up. So it's really unfortunate. So after finding out about this, he's immediately packs his bags and he's like, "Louisa, we're going home." And she's just like, "Oh, thank God. Oh, thank God." Anyways, Monroe begins his term as president, and John Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State for James Monroe. So a couple quick things to note first, because you have to understand that the reason why Henry Clay was really mad was because, by all accounts, if you were the Secretary of State for the current president, you were very likely, at least in terms of the next in line succession, to be president. I mean, it happened with Madison, Monroe, and a lot of people were basically being like, "Oh, well, I guess it's John Quincy Adams," and a lot of people had problems with John Quincy Adams basically being the Secretary of State. It wasn't any sort of nepotism. It wasn't anything like that, or name recognition to try and give Monroe some, some street cred by any stretch of the imagination. This is more so just about Monroe trying to unite this country, because the Federalists are dead, and he's just trying to make things equal, and wants to give everybody a voice, and wants to give every single human being a real opportunity to really voice their opinion. And in terms of unity, he basically gives all his cabinet members a say, obviously, more so than I think. He's probably one of the more deferential presidents. And not to mention, too, he specifically chooses cabinet members, and he chose, John Quincy Adams to represent the northern interests for the most part, because he would choose other people like John C. Calhoun in the south and the southern interests, etc., You know how it goes. But still, it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And John Quincy Adams, being back in America, would serve for the next 8 years as James Monroe Secretary of State. So before we get into it, whatever your personal opinion is of John Quincy Adams, etc., and how the Secretary of State is and how important it is undeniable one fundamental fact, that John Quincy Adams, as the Secretary of State for James Monroe, has done a lot. Whether you think it's good or not is up to the individual. Most historians, including myself, would at the very least say it is one of the most impressive runs as the Secretary of State, in terms of the level of influence, the amount of things he personally gets done that really so grossly shaped the Monroe presidency that it makes Monroe look like just a fucking genius. Which makes me question whether it's actually Monroe or John Quincy Adams who actually runs the show in a lot of ways. Anyways, Henry Clay, he goes back to the Congress, and for the most part, Clay just becomes his mortal enemy, ironically, for the better part of his entire time as Secretary of State, which makes things difficult for Adams because he didn't have a lot of political gain, and he just refused to play ball at times in terms of this political game. Anyways, first things first. First thing, part of the agenda. He'd be part of the negotiations with Canada and to set the boundaries along with Spain and the territory of East Florida. That's basically the first thing he does. And when he comes back around 1817 through 1819, he's just trying to clean up a lot of the stuff between, again, the problems with the British and the borders with Canada, and then also Spain and Florida. So first and foremost, before we get into all of that, being his Secretary of State, he actually gains a pretty close camaraderie with James Monroe. He probably becomes his closest, I would say, advisor within his cabinet. He follows a lot of the things that Adams really points to for the most part. And, despite, the problems, he ends up becoming a really solid member of the cabinet. And he kind of just leads in terms of just the direction of where the country is effectively going to be going in. Of course, he does the normal day-to-day stuff and the day-to-day operations that was required of just the Secretary of State, just trying to maintain relations with a whole bunch of other nations and try to figure some stuff out, for the most part, on maybe some expansion at this particular point, maybe just some communication and opening up some different trade routes with other countries, etc., etc. He does all that stuff. I would say probably he's known for 2 or 3 main things within this entire time of his Secretary of State. Again, first would have to be the Adams-Onis Treaty that is incredibly interesting and very important and kind of brilliant in a lot of ways. Let me set the background for it though. First and foremost, around 1817 to 1819, the problems with obviously the territory between the Canada, United States, and Spain, and Florida for the most part. Spain was just allowing things to run wild for the most part. Indians were raiding with the Spanish blessings, and slaves were fleeing to Spain to freedom. Although they were not really free, technically speaking, but again, to get away from the American masters, whatever your personal opinion is. It was chaos. Americans were getting attacked in what was known as the contested territory of Western Florida, and everyone's mad. Everyone's getting pissed off at each other. And Monroe's basically like, Jackson, do your thing. And Jackson's like, yo, homie, I got this shit, homie, and just goes in. Okay. Let me point this out too. John Quincy Adams actually really liked Andrew Jackson at one point, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but when John Quincy Adams is nominated for president, he actually is contemplating asking Jackson about being his vice president, but Jackson's like, I decline, because he's going to run himself. Anyways, Jackson, you Adams too, and especially when all the shit hits the fan and Jackson basically dominates the entire territory, makes Spain really kind of quiver in their boots, and basically just occupies Florida for the most part, although he does create a bit of an economic and international affair when he executes 2 British soldiers, and I believe he ends up executing a couple of his own men. This might be earlier during the War of 1812, although he lets a couple of them live after them getting shot, because he's a pretty empathetic man and felt very, very, like, it was one of those things he had to do. I'll get to that when I get to Jackson. Monroe was very mad at Jackson around this particular point in time, and John Quincy Adams actually is the reason why he didn't want to reprimand Jackson for the things that he did, because tempers calmed, and Monroe came to the realization that, like, okay, you know what, I get it. I see you. You're doing a good thing for the most part, and and Monroe God, I'm getting these names. Too many fucking presidents. And John Quincy Adams is basically like, hey man, if I do this treaty, it's gonna clear a lot of shit up. So I think this is gonna help a lot of people out. It's gonna figure some things out. Okay. So then he starts negotiations, with Spain first and foremost with this Adams-Onis Treaty. Negotiations are political, and this is a very tricky situation, which I have to be honest, which is why this is all the more impressive, because Quincy Adams isn't the most political individual. I think if anything, this is when he starts getting the most political. Part of his presidency, obviously, is a complicated venture in itself, but conflict is generally avoided despite it being potentially there for the most part. All in all, the Adams-Onis Treaty eventually has Spain leaving Florida and legitimate borders being established, because Louisiana Purchase was vague for the most part. You have to understand that, because Spain was still a territory of basically France. So when America bought the Louisiana Purchase and the Louisiana Territory, they also thought they got Spain, and it was just contentious territory for the better part of 20 years, because no one wanted to invade it, and then if we invaded it, it would have been like a bit of a crisis. It was like, oh, I thought you bought this territory, It's like, it's all politics, man. It's all kind of dumb sometimes, and I fucking hate it, but it is what it is. Anyways, and the territory gains that Spain would lay claim to in the southern part of California, as well, in terms of Louisiana Purchase as well. But the territory gained would be that of the Oregon County, not territory specifically. It's along with this Russo-American Treaty that defines the borders of what is effectively the Alaskan Territory too. There's a whole bunch of treaties he's doing right now, but he effectively makes the legitimate borders of the Northeastern Territory with one of these treaties, and then effectively borders with I believe that Alaskan Territory with the Russo American Treaty with Alaska for the most part, and then basically laying some claims to the Oregon Territory in some Oregon County, whatever you want to call it, to some extent. And I'm gonna get to that when I get to James K. Polk. For the most part, it's gonna be much more of his thing. I might be getting some things mixed up, so if you want to leave the Oregon thing out, I forgot what it was specifically, and I don't have it right in front of me, and I'm just kind of low key just doing a bit of live thing right now, and I'm drinking about 3 different bangs right now, so I'm vibing. Okay. Anyways, after that, the most other notable thing about his time during the Secretary of State ship has to be the actual Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe would give this doctrine to one of his congressional speeches, and he's basically saying, hey, yo, Europe, get the fuck out of North and South America. This is our territory, and you can't come here. Even though a lot of it was political, because there's a whole bunch of different revolutions, and they wanted to support the revolutions, and they didn't want to support any autocracies or monarchies, etc., etc. And this really put a strain on a couple of relationships. And a lot of people were saying we should side with Britain because they're starting this parliamentary system, and they're the closest with this ideologically speaking, in terms of because we were their colonies, and for the most part it seems like the smart play for the most part. But then he does this whole Monroe Doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine goes like this, and at least the creation of it, because James Monroe's thinking in his presidential White House office, and he's contemplating a lot of stuff's happening. A lot of the Spanish colonies are gaining their own independence, and we want to support them and show our support, and also show that no one should have any sphere of influence or greater sphere of influence. So at least the Monroe Doctrine, by its very nature, is if you have a colony there already, that's fine, but you can't have any more. You can't do anything else to any of these more individualistic countries down here. So what ends up happening is Monroe goes to his cabinet, because he goes to his cabinet to talk about some ideas to get to crowdsource, I guess you could say, is another way to say it. And he talks to everyone. He's trying to figure out what we should do. And John Quincy, everyone's basically is like, hey man, you should probably maybe side with Britain, all that stuff, the direction of this country, etc. Because you have to understand, a lot of people are doing in Europe are doing what is known as this Holy Alliance, because they're trying to regain the power of their monarchies and autocracies. Prussia, Austria, Russia. They're just trying to keep it together and trying to call these Republican revolutions, and and it's basically like England's the worst least option if we want to side with anybody. And Adams is in the room, and he's just vehemently against this, and he's basically just no, we're not doing this. We're not doing this. We are going to be our own nation, and we will find our own independent path, etc., etc. And Monroe's like, man, you are just vibing right now. I feel you, homie. Let's fucking do this. And I'd probably say 60-40 Adams, Monroe. The words and some of the intention is with Adams, but the belief is with Monroe. Excuse me. Which is why I still believe this is specifically the Monroe Doctrine. Well, anyways, this really changed a lot of things, at least in I can't think right now. This changed a lot of things, okay? And everyone's fucking just yeah, fucking... And America kind of just becomes a bit of an isolationist nation for the most part, the next 15, 20 years or so, until, Millard Fillmore begins much more of the international trade with, Japan and all that shit, and a whole bunch of other things start happening. Anyways, Adams was also a big creator of what is known as the merit system, because they're still trying to figure out how appointments and positions should be filled within the federal government. The most promising and most notable one would be Jackson's spoils system, where it's basically just hey, if you help me, I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back, kind of thing. It's not really like that. It's more just hey, you facilitated this, and I need more people I can actually trust within my actual cabinet, etc., etc. And I just need you on my side, so I'm gonna hire you for this position, instead of being what Quincy Adams was proposing during his time in the federal government, which was, hey, you've done a really good job, and you deserve this, and you earned it, for better or worse, etc., etc. So he was a big proponent of the merit system that actually made things a lot more diplomatic, at least during this particular really very peaceful time. And, it's based off of merit, not patronage. And all accounts, at least during the Monroe presidency, the government was far more held accountable and more checks and balances. People did their job, and I go back and forth on a spoils system and a patronage or a merit-based system, because it depends, because some people might just do merit-based stuff until they get to the actual political peak that they could possibly get to, and then at that point they might just be corrupt, who knows. And then patronage systems, I guess you could say, whatever your personal opinion is of it, may be politically biased, but if I'm going to be supportive of a particular individual, I'd want to, like, if I was president, I'd rather appoint my own people, if I'm just going to be honest. That's why I don't get why people get so upset when people start pointing, oh, this and that, and I'm just like, yeah, I'd want to do my own thing, and I'd rather have my own trusted advisors. Then again, that's just my 2 cents. Adams served 8 full years, the entire time as the Secretary of State. So let's just talk about the election. Let's just get it out of the way, because this is a deeply fascinating, incredible election that actually did occur in this country's history. So I'd probably say by 1820, after Monroe gets reelected, and it's clear he's going to follow Washington's step. Everyone follows Washington. They will always follow Washington. It's very clear that the direction of this country is going to be very fascinating and where it's going to go, okay? So let me just explain what's going to happen. 4 years, everyone knows that the election is going to be contested. There's going to be some... it's one party system at this particular point in time, and everybody in politics sees this happening, and they see the election of 1824 being a very critical election, especially for a lot of reasons. One, because the economy is it's recovering, it's up and down, but it's on the way up, I guess you could say. Depends on how you look at it, but the Panic of 1819 was a little bit difficult for a lot of people to bear. A lot of it they really couldn't figure it out, but whoever's going to be president is really going to be the president that's going to start the direction of which this country is really going to be going in. And let me just explain America at this particular point, because in America is kind of becoming a little bit of a much more open country, a little bit much more of a freer country, a little more democratic in a lot of ways. Like white suffrage became real, and like in this particular election, there's going to be a lot more, I guess, free white men voting, that didn't actually have to own land, and not to mention, too, that the changing of the voting rules, too, were also very different. So, like, the state legislature were the ones to actually make the votes for the electoral college, et cetera, et cetera. But now people could actually just specifically directly vote for their electors instead. I think there's only like 5 or 6 states that didn't allow it at this particular point in time. But point being that people had a lot more power to really influence the direction of this country. I'm going to do a complete episode on the election of 1824, and probably most of the elections. I'd probably say probably not some of the earlier ones, but it depends. We'll see. But the election of 1804, absolutely, it's just one of those that's just like, what the fuck. Anyways, the election of 1804, everyone's in a lot of senses has a shot, I guess. There's clear front runners. The 2 main ones are obviously John Quincy Adams himself, who, and I want to make this very clear. Every single candidate represents a part or section of this country. You want to talk about division? Every single one of these candidates specifically represents a division and piece of this country. John Quincy Adams is probably the number 1, at least in terms of like the early polling, et cetera, and he's leading the northern interest, the old school Federalist interest. Number 2 behind him is Andrew Jackson, who's this war hero who's beyond picking up steam. Can you just imagine if Andrew Jackson just abdicated and became, Quincy Adams vice president? That's really interesting. But anyways, he's probably number 2, and he represents like the Western interest, and it's very key, the Western interest, because if you have the West, you probably have this election. There's a lot of states that are opening up in the West. After that, there's William Crawford, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun. They all have their own representations for the most part. Calhoun specifically in the South, Crawford kind of like in the middle states, and then Clay is basically combating Jackson in the West, which I think that's a very interesting deal. 5 nominees from one party. Just think about that for 1 second, okay? This is very interesting. You have to understand, I don't think John Quincy Adams really wanted to run. I mean, the main reason why he wanted to run, because his wife didn't want him to run. He didn't even want to run. I think he was content with just retiring, really, at this particular point in time. There's a lot of reasons, but number one, I would probably say he had a lot of bright ideas. Like I said, he's pretty forward-thinking. He's pretty intelligent. He's pretty creative in his mindset. He had a lot of ideas for, domestic road systems that, I mean, if he saw us today, he'd be like, oh, I kind of thought of something like that, not the extent of like freeways and highways, but still, it's an idea. And number two, I think in part, he had a lot of respect for his father, and his father was really humiliated with the last election, and with his last election, and he's thinking to himself, I think in some ways he wants to vindicate his family's name and really make it more prominent and better than it actually is. Because you have to understand, honor is very, 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 very pure for a lot of these people. And it's very, very endearing, for a lot of these people. And again, Democrat, Republicans, Federalists at this point. This election showed how divided we are as a nation, that despite trying to be unionized and uniting as a country, people have different interests, people have different perspectives, and people have a whole bunch of different things that they have to go do. I understand, too, no one really campaigned. Campaigning wasn't a real thing at this particular point in time. You had other people campaign for you, and then you had, newspapers really influencing things. Campaigning really wouldn't occur until the election of 1840, to an extent, maybe 1836, maybe, but for sure 1840. So with the 12th Amendment, which changed the electoral system so that people could directly vote for their electors for the most part, among other things, more of a direct vote. It's very interesting because John Quincy Adams, by all accounts, was going to have this election in the bag. He had the North, and it was very clear that all the other states and all the other people were just going to be combating each other for basically whatever they could. And then Andrew Jackson throws his name in the ring, and he's a rising star, and everyone's really attacking Jackson. And the more they attack him, the more it's very clear that people like him. It's one of those things where it's just like the more you keep saying his name, he just gets more powerful and powerful and powerful. Say what you will about Trump, it's kind of like that a little bit, where you just keep saying it, and he just gains more notoriety, positivity, and like reputation. Same exact thing in a lot of ways. Jackson just becomes something bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. This is also one of the first popular votes, I think, in like 2 elections too. So just want to make that very clear. Election took a while, okay? Because once the electors elected who was the president, it took a while to count all the votes because nothing like this had happened. Because when the election and then all the dust settled, Andrew Jackson appeared to have won, but he did not win the majority of the electoral votes, which is the big thing. Because you have to understand, popular vote does not fucking matter whatsoever. It really doesn't. This is how our electoral college works. It's a checks and balance issue. And Andrew Jackson, I forgot how many electoral votes he had, but he did not win the majority. And I think it was probably like, 107 to like 90 to John Quincy Adams, who was number 2 in the electoral votes. So when it's a contested election like this, then it will go straight to the House, and the House will basically vote on it. It's basically whoever is their state legislator. I don't know if it's Senate or House of Representative members, but for the most part, whoever voted the majority in the respective houses, basically, gets that state officially for the most part, in terms of the elector. And the top 3 would be the ones that would make it. Which sucks because some political shenanigans happened, specifically in New York, in which case Crawford gets the 3rd spot instead of Henry Clay, which is really interesting. So Henry Clay's back in Congress, and he's like, fuck y'all, okay? Fuck y'all. And it goes to Congress. Now, there's a whole bunch of different stories, a whole bunch of different interpretations of what actually happened. But, by and large, John Quincy Adams, I would say, was asked... Because you have to understand, too, this took a long time for this to legislate out and to finally decide. From basically like November to like almost February. I don't want to say how long. At least a couple months for sure. They're trying to vote, trying to basically like debate who's the better candidate to choose as president, okay? And everyone's okay and calm. Quincy Adams is calm, Andrew Jackson's calm. No one's freaking out yet because they're all like, well, whatever happens, happens. I think that's really fascinating because once what does happen, everyone completely changes their tune. Anyways, it is very clear that Henry Clay first off, he hated Jackson. Clay hated Adams, but he hated Jackson more. And Crawford wasn't going to get enough votes to really pass anything because he was just going to be the loser. So the best option was John Quincy Adams, and maybe he can sway some of the western states, notably Kentucky, to the side of John Quincy Adams. So on at least 2, maybe 3 occasions, Henry Clay sends some people, and he talks to John Quincy Adams himself about making some form of a deal. And Adams doesn't want to do it. It's not that he's principled. It's just like he doesn't want to play this game, but he's thinking about it, and he's making a very interesting choice because ultimately at a certain point he just says, fuck it, I'll do it. Just do it. Do what you gotta do. If you do it, then I'll hook you up, homie, okay? So, effectively speaking, John Quincy Adams says yes, because what Henry Clay wants is to be the Secretary of State, because he wants to continue that line of succession, and he thinks that's partly his way to both gaining just power in general and hypothetically a voice and platform to be the next president, because that's what Henry Clay always wants. He wants to be fucking president. It's a little bit like Hillary. It's kind of weird. I don't like. God damn it! Why'd I have to connect Hillary Clinton and Henry Clay together? I don't like Henry Clay anymore. I'm just kidding. Anyways, so Henry Clay in the House basically just uses his fucking political magic, and he somehow manages to swap like pretty much every state that voted for him, or at least a couple of the states. Manages to swap like 4 states, and John Quincy Adams ends up getting the majority of states over Andrew Jackson. And it's funny is no one really cares because they're kind of just like, you know what, it is what it is. If Andrew Jackson's probably like, you know what, it is what it is. If they don't like me, then they don't like me. But then when word comes out that Henry Clay is going to be his Secretary of State, Andrew Jackson loses his shit because he's just like, this is a fucking corrupt bargain. These sons of bitches, you know what I'm saying? And in fairness, I'd probably be really fucking mad too because I'm just like, I don't care how you parse it. There's a whole bunch of people that will disregard this and repudiate what I've just said. I'm basically going off of logic, a relative objectiveness and reality. Not to mention too some documents that have just said, you know what, like Henry Clay kind of pushed Adams into the specific corner, and Adams really had no choice because it was either that or let Jackson win. And a lot of people thought Jackson was just not the dude. He may have been this homegrown person, but he was a volatile individual, or at least the perception of it, this angry person, which he definitely was, and not someone who's capable or suitable for being president, and they still wanted in some ways this aristocratic presidency, et cetera, and, they didn't think the common man was going to be good enough to effectively do this, say what you will about it. But as of right now, they all vote. John Quincy Adams wins. Takes 2 months to sort it out as Monroe ends up finishing his term. He's probably just looking like, what the hell is happening? Anyways, the corrupt bargain is very real. Whatever your opinion is of it, it's very real. And John Quincy Adams becomes the first and only president in this country's history to lose both the electoral vote and popular vote in this country's history. The only one. And let me make it here. Let me make the point here. No one else has ever lost the electoral vote. I just want to make that very clear, which is why this is really shocking. And from this point on, Andrew Jackson is basically like, you guys are dead to me. Not really dead yet. Once he becomes president, he goes on just a full fierce force of just pure anger, frustration, and chaos, and will intend to destroy Henry Clay and all the other people in the future. I can't wait to talk about Jackson. Anyways, John Quincy Adams becomes president, and he becomes enemies with Andrew Jackson almost immediately. So let me make it very clear about John Quincy Adams' presidency. You can't look online to find really anything that happened specific in his presidency, because a lot doesn't happen. A lot of it is gridlock, and I've got to be honest with you. It's a very ambitious agenda that he's trying to do, but it is just a genuine abject failure as a presidency in terms of just the overall lame duck Congresses, etc., etc., etc. I'm trying to be objective here. I'm trying to figure it out, but I've read about 2 different biographies on John Quincy Adams, and both of them don't go into as much detail about his presidency as, because nothing really happens. But I'm going to try and go into as much detail as I can with some of the specific policies and things that go along with his presidency, and I'm going to try and do my best to really detail it, because it's a fascinating presidency and a very fascinating point in time. Let me start by saying that John Quincy Adams, as a president, is this bridge president. He's the bridge president between the founding fathers and what will be the age of Jackson. I guess you could say the age of democracy in some ways. And for better or worse, people taking back this country. And I think it's really interesting to think about, because this is basically the last gasp of the aristocratic lifestyle and the aristocratic politicians and the establishment politicians, I guess you could probably say, the people who have just been there, who've just been the do-nothings for the most part. And I think this is like their last gasp. And I think this is why there's fascinating comparisons between Andrew Jackson and Trump, and when you really look at it, it's kind of like, okay, I can see the actual genuine comparisons at the very least and what's happening. Anyways, this is a very interesting point within this country's history that I think a lot of things really change, because you have to understand too, culturally speaking, the Industrial Revolution, at least the first part of it's really going. The market revolution's kind of happening. We're still in the thralls of the Second Great Awakening. Religion, everything is happening. It's all pointing towards eventually westward expansion. It starts with Jackson, and it starts with, and it really goes full blast with James K. Polk and Tyler and all those people when they're trying to annex Texas and the California Gold Rush and all that shit. It starts here in a lot of ways. It starts here because this era ends and the next one begins. And I think I'm fascinated by time, and I'm fascinated by eras, and I'm fascinated by how everything changes after this. This is just basically holding off what effectively will be the inevitable, and what the inevitable will effectively be, and that is Andrew Jackson. Anyways, once he gets inaugurated, again, it's ambitious, but it's an abject failure. He's not a politician. I can't keep saying this enough. He's basically just this really kind of crabbly old guy who with, a fiery personality that people just want to vote for because he's relatively objective and just does, his own thing. And he's kind of a wild card. And I think that's what people always relatively liked about him, despite him not being so very personable. And again, let me make it very clear too. It's not like he didn't have any friends, okay? It's just, he had a bit of a tough personality just like his father, and wasn't as empathetic or sympathetic for the most part. He had emotions, he had feelings, and he was a very cognizant and conscientious individual. But, he had his wants, he had his needs, and he's a little bit more selfish, I would probably say, in a lot of instances, in a lot of ways, and far more opinionated, I would say, especially in his later life, than his father. But anyways, he's not a politician, and Congress, for most of the entire time, was gridlocked. Not to mention, too, his vice president would be John C. Calhoun. He was basically opposed to Adams once this whole entire corrupt bargain thing happened. And Calhoun just basically, for the next 4 years, intended to just ruin John Quincy Adams and his overall presidency at every single term in time that he could basically get. Because he's basically, John Calhoun is a fascinating figure, and he's just going to be starting the Democratic Party with Jackson and Van Buren. Because the Democratic-Republican Party, the Democratic section of it, would be, basically separating, and all you would have is the Republican Party that would effectively become the Whigs, and then ironically the Republican Party again, or the Free Soil Party, whatever you want to call them. Separate. They would separate. There's a whole bunch of different political parties. It's very hard to keep up with all these different factions coming up. Anyways, this is also the point where the Democratic Party, in a lot of ways, is created and born, which is another big reason why this is very fascinating. Because their first actual election is, as a Democrat specifically, is Andrew Jackson in the following election. But they call Andrew Jackson, like, Tennessee basically nominates Andrew Jackson for president like a month after John Quincy Adams is elected president. Like, it's already very clear it's going to be these two going head to head. So John Quincy Adams is kind of like thinking ahead too, and like, fuck, I gotta go against this motherfucker again. Anyways, I should probably actually talk about his fucking presidency. First and foremost, Adams' cabinet is filled with, like, Monroe, aside from one person leaving near the end. His cabinet is basically just a whole bunch of different people in a whole bunch of different places, okay? It never changes, just like with Monroe. Many of them still continuing from Monroe's cabinet, basically. He's just continuing with the Monroe legacy, I guess, at this particular point. Because Monroe did have a legacy. He had a strong 8 years, despite economic problems, and, he was just continuing what Monroe was doing. I would note just a couple of them. William Wirt as his Attorney General, and Sam Southward as his Secretary of the Navy, being probably the two most prominent ones. That would be a part of the basically the pre-Civil War era for the next several decades for the most part, and influencing politics in that particular way. Notably was also Calhoun as Vice President, and of course Secretary of State Henry Clay. Calhoun detested both of them, and they would spend most of the time voting against Adams and Clay, while Clay attempted to basically run the country in their particular view. Because remember, if you're the vice president, you're the Senate head for the most part, and you basically are the tie-breaking vote in case a tiebreaker ever happens. And guess who's voting against you? It is John C. Calhoun. I should also note, very unfortunate and funny at the very same time, is he would have one Supreme Court appointment, a justice named Robert Trimble, who would die on the court during Adams' term, by the way, and he would try to replace him again, but Congress would just tell him to fuck off, basically, and left it open for Jackson, which unfortunately would change the Supreme Court for quite literally decades after that. I'll explain with Jackson, which I would probably say is his only negative. Which I would probably say is his only negative throughout his entire presidency. Problems arose immediately as Adams attempted to grossly expand the federal government in order to achieve a lot of his internal improvements. Many of his proposals, along with his personality and just being a straightforward nature, led to immense gridlock from the very get-go, like that. Like, literally just from the very get-go. It's like, okay, no, we're not going to expand this. We're not going to do your road structures, infrastructures, and all that. We're just going to keep doing canals and just say, fuck you, John Quincy Adams. Everyone did not like Henry Clay or John Quincy Adams. Even some of the people that were on their contingent side of the Democratic Republican Party were very apprehensive to side with them. They're all Jacksonians, I guess you could say. They're all Democrats at this particular point in time, and it would only continue to basically get even more gridlock when specifically Democrats, and those people in that particular section of the Democratic Republican Party or Democratic Party, I'm just going to say Democrat Party at this particular point in time, they would win a majority of the seats, I believe, in both houses for the most part in 1826, where they begin just rushing through legislation to improve the South at the cost of the North. And I'll explain that at the very end of Quincy Adams' presidency. Got really nothing done, basically, because they're just all fighting with each other. And Henry Clay is trying to use all the political doodads and shenanigans that he can basically maneuver, and it's really not working. The world's in it's been a very fascinating time at this particular point in time, because England opens up the first, what I would probably say is the first modern steel railway. Not to mention too, the Erie Canal also opens up in 1825, I believe, 1824. Around that, and understand, Erie Canal is really big. Any canal is really big because that's how the most forms of expansive transportation really occurred. Just big ass boat and then just go down the river. instead of trying to go on cobblestone roads trying to carry shit. It's not a very fundamentally sound way to transport stuff. America's improving, and industry's improving, and it's in a bit of a gridlocked situation right now because we're trying to do northern interests and southern interests, and the country's in a very fascinating point economically and socially. A lot of things are happening too, where there's a lot more freedom, a lot more people are having a voice to say. The white poor man is kind of taking things back and putting it into their own hands so that they have an opportunity to actually succeed and allow things to be equal for all points, for the most part. For the first 2 years, I would say, 1825 to 1826, it's just a trying time for John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay to a lesser extent. A lot of things are happening, even though it should be a promising, several couple years. I mean, 1826 is the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence that also, unfortunately, coincides with his own father's death and the death of Thomas Jefferson. So that really brings a bit of a sad day for everyone in the United States of America. And it again, it's a trying time because John Quincy Adams' presidency is just fascinating because like his father dying, Declaration of Independence, all of it just really points to this really being the end of an era, and I think that's really fascinating the way I look at it for the most part. I should also point out too, the very first photographs are really made. I guess they're called like these Daguerre whatever types. You basically like put some form of light sensitive sheet of paper. There's a whole bunch of things you can do. Maybe some form of phosphorus paper in a box with a small hole, and you can basically just create an image that way because the actual light in the image goes into the because I'm a radiology student. Very different concept with X radiation and all that stuff, but for the most part it's just about trying to get the actual photons themselves centered on that particular type of film. And I think that's a little bit of an interesting little tidbit that I was able to look up and uncover. Because John Quincy Adams would be generally one of the first presidents to be photographed and actually have their photographs taken of them, which I think is fascinating. I kind of wish Madison had a photograph taken of him. I kind of would be interested in what he'd look like. But America's also improving too. Despite the economic problems, we're improving industrially as well. We're creating our own pathways regardless of the federal government. Industry's really moving us forward. We're creating the first railroads, which are really interesting because they're horse powered. So just imagine like a horse pulling, just railed like a train. I just think that's really funny. But we're improving. It's a little by little. Beethoven dies in 1827. Edgar Allan Poe does his first book of poetry. Sarah Hale, if you don't know who she is, she publishes the first anti-slavery novel. It's called Northwood. I've never actually read it, but it's a very fascinating story at the very least when you just look up, the brief outline of it. Not to mention too, a lot of things are happening where African Americans are also in the North specifically are really improving. They're getting their own rights and whatnot. They're actually becoming citizens by their own, however they can in their own capacity. They actually start their own first newspaper known as the Freeman's Journal in 1827 still. It's also the first recorded strike by female workers. Actually, I don't know about female workers. I know it's factory workers up in the North Jersey, which I think is funny because they're like, can we get like a 10-hour workday? I'm just saying, can it be fair? Like the country's improving. We're moving towards this pathway of technological invention and progression. Like Edgar Allan Poe would release his first book of poetry soon after, and like history is happening in front of us, and a whole bunch of different things are all coinciding during Adams' presidency. At the very least, these are the certain things that are coming up that I found to be fascinating during Adams' presidency. So anyways, like I said, the first 2 years, it's quite literally gridlock, as much as gridlock as you can ever fucking imagine, Like, it's just imagine trying to like veto, and you can't do anything about it. Excuse me. Like, the only thing it could really get done was the Erie Canal, but that was about it. I mean, and some military standards and improvement as well. But those are things that Congress was, for the most part, going to be allowing, especially since, their disasterly war of 1812. So like I said before, John Adams Sr. unfortunately dies at the age of 90. It breaks John Quincy Adams' heart. That's his idol, the person he wanted to be, the person who's the president. The whole reason why he's the president again, which at the very least he got the solace of at least his father seeing his son become president. So I think that's really cool. From 1827 on, his presidency is just an absolute roller coaster, at least the rest of it. Like 1826, 1827, or late November, one of those years, he's able to basically go into negotiations with Great Britain. Henry Clay really helps out with this to gain a lot of the, I guess you could say, restitution that's reserved with, again, Tsar Nicholas, I believe, at this particular point. Let me see, yeah, because I know Alexander's out by 25, so this is probably about 26, 27. Nicholas takes over and is a mediator between U.S. and Britain. Basically, Britain's paying back a lot of the shit that they kind of fucked us over with. The country at this particular point too, debt is a bit of an issue, and they're trying to figure it out still. John Adams does not want to raise taxes, so which is the biggest reason why there's really no real taxes levied for the most part. It really doesn't occur until later on within the 20th century. Most of the time, you actually raise any sort of tax whatsoever. It's going to be in the form of like maybe a sales tax, a tariff, etc., etc. You know how it goes, unfortunately, and it's no different in this particular time. So he wanted to raise money and not tax people, so he went to battle with some tariffs and basically had Congress, for the most part, come up with their own tariff. And it's very complicated, this particular tariff. Part of it could be more politically motivated. I would absolutely argue, after reading some notable sources, a couple biographies, mainly Van Buren's biography, because Martin Van Buren is a very fascinating and very politically savvy political figure around that particular time. And he basically ran New York with his Albany Regency, whatever you want to call it, for quite some time. Anyways, in order to raise money, he had to do the tariff, and some might say in part due to Van Buren's opposition in Congress, at the very least through some political shenanigans. John Quincy Adams raised tariffs, where basically he would cause more international relations with Britain at one point, because it's a little bit of a problem, because, like I said, despite the restitutions, the relationship with Britain and America is still really fucking tense. Hella tense, okay? And they would be for quite a while, until probably after the Civil War, I would probably say. But for the most part, he's just trying to raise protectionist tariffs to protect industry within the North, for the most part, which the South really fucking hated. They really, really, really hated. But he worked diligently before to improve trade throughout Europe and a whole bunch of different countries, trying to create a trade system, most favored nation, which would really help out continuous trade internationally for the most part, like Russia, France, all the nations that he can try and get his hands on, because it can't just be Britain. But that was his original tariff, and everyone's just like, ugh. Because you have to understand, North and South, if it's a protectionist tariff, it's going to help the North, because then that means really, the South can only sell their products to the North, and if it's not a protectionist tariff, then they can make more money selling it internationally, and the North kind of suffers in that particular way, which sucks, but it is what it is. Unfortunately, a second tariff by Congress made life for a living hell for southern states, as northern states and western states greatly benefited from it, but politically, at least politically for the most part, but it improved the now rising economy, at least in the North. And it's known as the Tariff of Abominations, which basically was the nail in the coffin that ruined his chances of basically any form of re-election. Let me explain the Tariff of Abominations real quick. the significance of the tariff of abominations would have reverberating effects not only in Adams' presidency, but Jackson's presidency as well. Some will debate on the reason why this tariff was made, but I would probably agree with the political shenanigans of that particular time and era. It was proposed by Jacksonian Democrats for the most part, notably like John C. Calhoun was a big advocate for it. And you have to understand tariffs, because, like I said, I mean, it was bad enough that Quincy basically had increased the tariff rate from to his tariff. His tariff was about 35% tax on the imported goods or whatever, and the tariff of abominations would be raised all the way to 50%. And why he signed it, I think, was two-part. One, a sign of okay, so you guys are understanding the necessity of northern industry. So I don't think he was politically savvy, unfortunately. That, and I just think he wanted to, I think he thought of this as a bit of a bridge to the Democrats in the last 3 years of aggressive opposition that he was facing as president for the most part. And also, they couldn't agree on anything. So I think at that particular point, he realized he wasn't going to win re-election. So he just said, fuck it. I don't care. It is what it is. Well, I mean, and that sounds bad. Don't get me wrong. But, you have to understand, after 3 or 4 years of fighting with these people, it's probably really exhausting. And you're not going to win the re-election. But you're going to go down swinging, and you're going to go down fighting because you're John Quincy Adams, and you're just as stubborn as your fucking father. And that's John Quincy Adams to me. So that the tariff of abominations, you have to understand, will reverberate for years to come, because it basically just grossly damages the Southern economy. So much so to a point that it actually, I would probably say, this is the big starting trigger that really begins Southern secession. The first attempt at Southern secession is because of, I believe it might just be because of this tariff for the most part. Functionally, this would basically force South Carolina to basically just be like, nah, we're not doing this, and then it would create what would be known as the nullification crisis, which I'm going to talk about more in Jackson's presidency, where basically South Carolina says the state has the right to do whatever the fuck they want. They don't have to follow or do all this, etc., and it causes a bit of a union stir. So basically, it was a very fascinating political gamble that would have ramifications for probably the next 40 years. And it's one of those watershed what-if moments, which is probably the one big notable aspect of John Quincy Adams' presidency. So what happens? What happens during this particular time, okay? By the next election, it's very clear that the election is going to go to Adams. They have done Jackson, for whatever your personal opinions of Jackson and et cetera, he chose his people well, and everyone that was with him was so wholly devoted to him that they've done everything they possibly could, basically short of killing their own people, to get Andrew Jackson elected as president. Everything is set up so that they could basically make John Quincy Adams' presidency a life of living hell for the most part. Nothing would get done in those 4 years, and I will say this is probably the only time in our country's history where genuinely nothing got done during a specific president's term in office. And it's by, the strict reality of just how politics were back then. It's really unfortunate. I would have been very curious to see what John Quincy Adams would have been able to do had it not been for Andrew Jackson's goons, I guess you could say. Again, it depends on how you feel about Andrew Jackson. But I will say that at least he fought, and at least he tried, and he would not go down without a fight. So immediately in this new, I guess, weird National Republican Party that's being created, or still the Democratic Republican Party, depends on how you want to look at it, the beginnings of the Whigs, John Quincy Adams effectively is elected and is going to run as the incumbent and try and fight for a second term. He doesn't, partly because he didn't want to be like his dad, and also because, like I said, he's not going to go down without a fight. But make it very clear, that John Quincy Adams knows he's probably not going to win. And I think that's why a lot of people had issues with John Quincy Adams during this effective campaign, because of the election of 1828 is one of the most vicious in terms of political fervor. And I'm talking about You should read some of the paper headlines that are lobbying to each other. I mean, John Quincy Adams in the newspapers are basically calling Andrew Jackson's wife a fucking whore and his mother a prostitute who just sleeps with a bunch of fucking men. And I'm just like, Jesus fucking Christ, like, and those are what is happening. You think we have political discourse today? Go back to fucking 1828. I'll put it that way, okay? Just look at some of the shit that happens. It actually gets so bad that Andrew Jackson's wife, who already had debilitating heart problems and high blood pressure, ends up dying because of this entire election, unfortunately. Andrew Jackson would never forgive these men, and he would make it his life goal to make sure that these men effectively suffered for the rest of their lives, at least while he's in political office. So the election really starts, and it's really dirty. A lot of scandals, fighting with one another, basically the ineffectuality and baldness, I guess, of John Quincy Adams, the brutality of Andrew Jackson. It is a volatile campaign, a very interesting campaign. The election of 1828 was such a substantial and embarrassing loss for John Quincy Adams, the electoral vote being Andrew Jackson winning 178 out of the 261 possible electoral votes, an overwhelming majority of the popular vote as well. John Quincy Adams loses his re-election bid, and Andrew Jackson becomes the 7th president of the United States of America. And despite knowing all this stuff was going to happen, you have to understand he's still depressed, he's still sad, he's still really embarrassed. Put him in a bit of a small depression. This is also compounded too with the reality of his family life, because you have to understand too, which I totally forgot, was Louisa Adams was, for the most part, a diligent first lady, and his family life would have some troubles during the entire time of his presidency. Notably, when he lost the presidency, it's also compounded by the apparent... It's complicated. I'm going to be honest with you. I've tried to look this up, and I'm trying to figure it out, but his son, George Adams, apparently committed suicide by jumping off a boat. We still cannot fundamentally confirm it. Depends. I'd probably say it was a suicide because a lot of his kids would be alcoholics and have a lot of problems, unfortunately, throughout a lot of their lives. And it put him in a bit of a small depression once he lost this election. And it's unfortunate, Things might change if he actually had an opportunity to do things, and who knows? I'm not someone so keen that the federal government should have all the power in the world, but at the very same end of the spectrum, you can't stop the people from doing what they want to do, and that's just the fact. And I think if I'm gonna be honest, I think if Quincy Adams' election is if his time as president is anything, is that the people vote you in, and if you can't do the job effectively, you can't play the political game, you can't do whatever it is they're fucking doing. And you can be as principled as you can humanly be, and I will always respect an individual who does that. But if you get nothing done, then honestly, what's the fucking point, So it's a bit of a tricky game that John Quincy Adams is effectively playing during this point in time. So, despite the embarrassment, it is absolutely fair to say that he's happy to retire, okay? He's roughly in his 60s at this point, okay? And he actually gets to be able to be with his family. And Louisa, his wife, is finally fucking happy and thrilled with private life. So I'm not gonna lie, his post-presidency is very interesting, but I'm gonna probably be brief with this for the most part with his post-presidency. Just so I can, get this thing done and out of the way, and I'm trying to streamline this so it doesn't all end up being like 3-hour long episodes. So I don't know why I'm doing this right now, because this is probably going to end up being a 3-hour long episode just because I'm explaining it this way. Anyways, after 3 years, for the next 3 years for the most part, and he'd be basically just plodding around the house. He's enjoying his life. He actually and does in some ways try to go back into, the law for the most part, but he really just putters around the garden just like his father, And I think it's really interesting because everything's kind of pointing him in the same direction as his father. Just enjoying his retirement, putting around the garden, playing with the grandkids, farming to an extent until you really can't farm anymore. Reading as much as you can, poetry, literature, maybe go teach, maybe go explore your plantation, farm, and do all the stuff you used to do as a kid. At first he enjoys the private life with Louisa. She's finally happy because she doesn't have to do this shit anymore, and she's just vibing with herself, doing her her mid 50s, whatever she's vibing to around that time. I don't know, the violin, the cello, whatever you want to fucking call it. And they're trying to get their kids to survive. So the kids would be struggling. I'll put it that way. After about 3 years of doing that, Quincy gets bored. He gets very bored. You have to understand, he's technically speaking in politics longer than his father's ever been. I'd say his father went into politics technically since like 1776, all the way into about 1801. That's about 25 years. John Quincy Adams has spent, the better part of almost 40 years technically. At the very least, like 35 years in politics. This is his life. He's done this. He's got nothing else to do. He still hates the law. Don't know why he keeps going back to it sometimes, but a lot of things trigger it. Boredom, wanting to do something with his life again, and he also sees the chaos in the Jackson administration, because this is with the whole teapot, not teapot dome. That's Warren Harding. The petticoat affair, I believe it is. It's with his cabinet member. God, I can't think of the name right now. And I just listened to a long form audiobook on Jackson. Fuck, I can't think of the name. But anyways, he's seeing all this stuff happen in the Jackson administration, and understand too. I think it's interesting because John Adams never thought to just run for Congress after his presidency, because he probably thought it's below him, but John Quincy Adams kind of just like, YOLO, whatever. So John Quincy Adams does the unthinkable and runs for Congress. And this actually leads to him winning a seat in the House of Representatives, which he would serve on for the rest of his life. The only president, by the way, to serve in Congress after being president. His wife is not happy, and she does not support his decision to do this. And while she's basically still going to be with him, obviously, she just refuses to really participate in all the wifely duties that are, in fairness, John Quincy Adams is kind of like, you know what, I understand. I don't blame you, fam. And again, their marriage is going to be very rough from this point on, for the most part. But he wins. He rejoins the Congress and would basically die in Congress. But I'll get to that in just a second. So most of the time that he's in Congress, he's just he's a Whig eventually at this particular point, and he is just vehemently anti-democrat and generally anything that expands slavery whatsoever. He's also at this point unapologetically abolitionist. He's been reading a lot of literature. Let me make it very clear too. Excuse me. What does it mean to actually be an abolitionist? Because I think in terms of how we view abolitionists, it's not what we view as an abolitionist. I think abolitionist was like, you might not be equal to us, but that doesn't mean that, you are, or you should be a free slave, or be a slave, if that makes any sense. Because when I think of a radical abolitionist, I think those are the people that are like, they are equal to us, etc., etc., etc. Now, did I believe John Quincy Adams was racist and think less of black people? I don't know. I don't think so. His father certainly didn't. At least I don't think so. So I don't think he had those same particular views of his father. But at the very least, you should understand that. And there's some writings that kind of go back and forth between his specific abolitionist views and, some potential thinking. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm not trying to shit on him. I'm just trying to clarify his specific perception of abolition, because what he's doing is very bold and very incredible at this particular time. But I'm just trying to give some extra context to that. That being said, he is a straight-up abolitionist at this particular point. Anything that expands slavery, he's vehemently against. He's just going ape shit against them. He's like, fuck you, Van Buren. I'm just going to be abolitionist. I don't know why I did that. Anyways, it gets to just a genuine point that it's what's known as the gag rule, where basically any talk and tabling of slavery is just going to be tabled. And that's primarily because of John Quincy Adams, unfortunately. He's so fucking aggressive with his particular view. He's just going apeshit with it. Other than the obvious anti-Democrat stuff, he's basically there also to just fix tariffs and internal improvements during his entire tenure. He's trying to do the things that he could never do during his presidency. You have to understand that, he was... that above all the things that he wanted to do of internal improvements, he also wanted to expand like a whole bunch. Like he wanted to create like the Smithsonian, the observatories, going to science, for instance, really push that. And a lot of them were like, science? Who wants to do scientific improvements in any way, shape, or form that's actually going to help technological improvements and better the country in a whole bunch of meaningful ways and put us on the international map? Ooh, sorry about that. My lord, just imagine. Again, I'm not trying to say that his presidency would have been a success or anything. If anything, it probably would have been a much bigger train wreck, if anything. But that being said, at least some of the ideas that he was espousing were very positive in nature, and I think they probably would have gone a long way to help better the country. And it just sucks. Like, his wife didn't support him. He was very outspoken against slavery. His wife was just not there. So he's a lone wolf. He's doing all this shit by himself. And even some of the Whigs in Congress are kind of just like, okay, man, you're pushing it a little bit. But he's going to keep getting reelected mainly because people support him. They love him. A lot of the people that voted for him in the second election were people that were in Massachusetts in that specific congressional district. So he's just going to keep going in and going in. So he's basically solidified for the rest of his life, for the most part, in that particular point and spot. So what else does he do during this particular point in time? Post-presidency, in his re-election to Congress, and then his death. Well, the most notable thing he does is, it's two things. One, the Amistad case. The Amistad. For those of you who don't know the Amistad, I kind of want to do an episode on that by itself. It'll probably be like a quick 50-minute hitter. For the most part, slaves coming from Africa, I believe, excuse me, are basically just rebel entirely on the ship, kill all their slave captors and whatnot, and they're being put on trial and being put to death. And John Adams is like, well, hang on. These men basically fought for their freedoms, etc. Anyways, long story short, the Amistad case, he argued for the freedoms of these slaves because he argued that they did so in, basically in self-defense and for my own constitutional rights, and that they are here, and they deserve some rights for the most part. And this is a little bit before, the Dred Scott decision, a whole bunch of these different decisions. The Jackson courts, I would probably say the Taney court would be a very complicated court in this country's history. But for the most part, the Amistad case that I'm having Andrew Jackson on the brain right now, that John Quincy Adams would be the actual counsel for all these slaves and African Americans, actually wins the case and basically was able to send them home. That, and the thing that he really wanted to fight for was the establishment of the Smithsonian Museum, which does open in 1846. John Quincy Adams lives a very long time. Okay? A very long time. I can go way more relatively in depth with his details in life, but for the most part, nothing specifically grand or interesting happens. If it's a modern day president, I'll probably go much more into the day-to-day stuff because I think that'd be more interesting to think about, with Bill Clinton, for instance, or Reagan, but for the most part, it's just normal day-to-day stuff. I'm gonna vote Whig, etc., etc. So one time, on February 22nd, House has a meeting in Congress, and It's 1848, by the way. So he gets reelected. He's basically in Congress for another 17 years after his presidency. Jesus fucking Christ. During the congressional session, he's just like, he's having trouble breathing. He's like, oh man. And the vote or whatever, the speaker, I forgot the actual event that they're actually in during this particular point in time, but John Quincy Adams stands up and he's like, no, and then falls to the floor. And he dies of a heart attack at the age of, God, what, 80, God, how old is this motherfucker? My brain is not working right now. It's 33, but 81, 82 years old around this particular point in time. God. John Quincy Adams dies at around 81, 82 years old on February 22nd, 1848. A great orator, but terrible personal talking, just really connecting with people. So, how does one feel about John Quincy Adams? I tend to go all over the place with sorry, I'm adjusting myself. I tend to go all over the place, honestly, with John Quincy Adams, because on one hand, you can think a lot of the things that really occurred in his life was through luck, through nepotism, through this ability of opportunity that he really had, and in fairness, he took advantage of. It's undeniable. But the very same end of the spectrum too, he's not a dummy. He's always a very intellectual person. He went to so many different schools, was able to comprehend so many different types of political theories, talk. He was exposed to a whole bunch of different things, and he's not a dummy. And despite being the son of John Adams and taking a lot of his responsibilities and stuff, and he's pretty smart. He understands the substantial need of a republic and understands the fundamental reason and need of a federal government. And at the very least, it depends on how you look at it. I think he probably would have understood that there's limits and limitations, and I think he attempted to make himself as principled as he humanly could be within the relative time and era and reason that he basically grew up with. He's not at all a perfect person. He's far from it. He has a lot of character flaws and a lot of character defects that just don't make him a good president. It's I was having a conversation, and I was just saying about modern candidates, for instance, and I tend to like a guy like Rand Paul, who I think is a very fascinating and highly intellectual individual, but also has the personality of a stump. So it's also really difficult to talk about this, and that's why, when I was talking to some of my friends, and we're thinking of the future elections, for instance, and who would be the most charismatic but compromised intellectual candidate to actually maybe run for president, and my first thought is Rand Paul, but then I'm just like, no, he can't do it. And in a lot of ways, he kind of reminds me of a much more libertarian John Quincy Adams, if that makes any sense. And that's just John Quincy Adams, unfortunately. And again, I love Rand Paul. I'm not trying to shit on him. There are things that a president needs to be. You are the example that you set the example, if you're the president of the United States, you are the leader of your party. You're the leader of the country, of every single United States citizen, okay? And when you are the way you are, it becomes a problem. It becomes a functional problem because, some people won't be able to get over the reality of who you are. You might be bored, stubborn, and whatnot, and trying to actually help people, but no one's going to reelect you if you're boorish and unlikable, It's like, say what we will about Trump, but that's probably his biggest flaw right now is that he's toned it down a little bit, in fairness. I don't know why I'm bringing modern politics into this. I guess I'm just trying to use it in a comparison because, there's a lot of things about John Quincy Adams you can like. And when you look at his whole life, and you look at his personality, it's kind of like just pure disappointment is the only thing that really reverberates in what John Quincy Adams is. And it's unfortunate because ultimately I do believe that is his legacy, is disappointment. You know, the one time in his career he was truly successful in his endeavors in life, really, I would probably say, is basically being the Secretary of State. That's about it. And it's a shame, because if you want to talk about a person with more foreign policy experience, more experience being an actual diplomat, talking and negotiating with other countries, trade deals, treaties and whatnot, there's really no other person at this particular point in history that has more experience than John Quincy Adams. And it's one of those things that bugs you a little bit, because you kind of just ponder to yourself, like, what does it take to be a president? Because if it's not the experience of negotiations, relations, etc., what is it? What makes and constitutes a good president? And I'm trying to figure that out. And that's why I think John Quincy Adams is kind of like a puzzle, I think about him, and I am so puzzled, and I can't understand why. So my only conclusion ultimately is just that for all the good things that John Quincy Adams brings to the table in terms of the objective good that he could hypothetically bring, is also a lot of the characteristics that you really don't tend to think about that are fundamentally important to what makes a good president, quality of personality and character that ultimately drives, and inspires people to really go about and do things, to live their life, and to step up to the plate and challenge when opposition rises and opposes you in such an aggressive and egregious way, like his own colleagues, for the most part, in the Democratic Party. It's not even foreign people. He's not going against, I don't want to say foreign people like with Abraham Lincoln, but he's not going against a clear opposition like Abraham Lincoln did, or FDR with the Nazis and, Imperial Japan. He's going against his own people, and he can't even win that. So it just makes you think how strong this particular president is, and how capable this particular president is. So who is John Quincy Adams anyway? He's a tough one, because I don't know where he would rank, legacy-wise and historically speaking. And let me make it very clear, too. I think he also should get some of the benefit of the doubt, because he has to follow in his father's footsteps. And that's really, really difficult to do, especially when your father is the second president of the United States, who had to follow in the footsteps, ironically, of, at the very least, in my view, the most important and arguably the greatest president of all time. That every single one of these presidents, since forever, even Trump, has tried to follow, for the most part, the example that Washington set. But now he gets to double it because he has to follow, John fucking Adams, the legend, the man, the myth, the portly bro, you know what I'm saying? The ultimate Chad. How can he compete with that? He can't beat Paul Giamatti. It's impossible. Although, ironically, Paul Giamatti actually looks more like John Quincy Adams than he does John Adams. I just want to point that out, too. So I guess my final thoughts ultimately will be this. I tend to feel sorry for John Quincy Adams. Despite, having a lot of the things in his life that really allow him to, achieve what he was able to achieve, I don't know if he was ever a truly happy person. He's always told to do things. He was always pushed to go about his life in that particular way, and it's tough, Like, and again, I don't want to be like rich people get depressed too, and they suffer, but it's tough, I don't think he really had as good of an upbringing in childhood, the formative years where he was able to make a lot of friends, for instance, and really built a camaraderie. And I don't think his father was there enough to really give him the example that, his father gave him in terms of how to be a man and how to work the farm and do all that stuff. And, being away from the mother, the nurturing figure, it's really difficult, And you have to find those examples from other people, and a lot of those other people probably won't be the sufficient source that you really need. You can only learn so much from your teachers, but when you have to learn that there is a bit of a public, environmental factor that comes up with your upbringing that's just as crucial than your actual learning and education. John Quincy Adams, I think, is a victim of childhood, and I think just an awkward upbringing. And I think a lot of things would be different if in his life, and his children's life, and his siblings' life too, if they weren't raised in the particular way that they were functionally raised. And it's unfortunate, and it's not John Adams' fault, I believe. If you're gonna, it gets to a point where it's like, the betterment of a nation and people, requires some sacrifice. And I get that. And I'm functionally for it for the most part. But, it's tough. Because people will get hurt when stuff like that happens. And people get left in the dust sometimes. And for John Quincy Adams, he gets left a lot. You feel like he gets left out a lot, And I look at his life and I just see someone who just struggles. And both personally, emotionally, in his life, even financially in the near future too. And I tend to think to myself, like, I don't know if he's ever happy. He just feel like he's just going through the motions of life. And don't get me wrong, it just sucks because I think a lot of people felt that way too. And a lot of them really couldn't take their lives into their own hands. And I think, at least for John Quincy Adams, the only time he ever felt like he could take his life into his own hands was when he was in the political machine and in the actual political sphere and realm for the most part. Like, after 3 years of retirement, like, he just had this need to go back in. And he would die on that political floor, which leads me to believe that this is the only thing that really, relatively speaking, brought him a semblance of control, a semblance of happiness, and a semblance of peace, I would probably say. John Quincy Adams, objectively, in my personal view, is a bit of a failure as a president, and a pure disappointment as a person with just incredible amount of potential, but understandable to why that potential ultimately failed. Ultimately, he's still the president right before Jackson, and he is officially the end of an era and the end of the Founding Fathers. That's John Quincy Adams, guys. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you guys listen to the next episode.